Good evening, dear listener. I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this quiet hour with me. Perhaps you are lying back in your favorite chair, or resting beneath a quilt that carries the faint scent of cedar. Tonight, I invite you to let the world grow smaller, one breath at a time, until it is only you, the steady hush of your own breathing, and the gentle flow of story. This tale drifts across time to harbors where ships once rocked at anchor, and voices in smoky taverns carried news of men and women who dared to live beyond the edges of ordinary life. Some names are familiar, like Blackbeard, painted in fire and smoke, and others, like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who moved like shadows at the edge of legend. Yet what matters most is not the clash of steel or the roar of cannon, but the quieter moments between. The look of a lantern on dark water, the weight of choices made in silence, the restless tide that touches every soul. Before we set sail together, may I ask a small kindness? If you find these gentle voyages help you drift, I'd be honored if you would like this story. Subscribe for the ones yet to come, and perhaps leave a note sharing where you are listening from. I imagine a circle of us scattered across towns and coasts, linked by a common wish for rest. So dim the lights. If you can, open a window to let the night breeze stir the curtains, or imagine the soft whir of a fan, the pop of a quiet hearth, or the creak of a porch swing under stars. Let those small sounds remind you that you are safe, that the hour is meant only for ease. And with that, we turn to the first part of our journey. A story begins as the harbor rests. The evening comes slowly in a port town, the way a tide pulls back after a long day. Lamps are being lit one by one, their yellow halos stretching across cobbled streets. The smell of salt and tar lingers, mixed with wood smoke drifting from kitchens where suppers cool on rough-hewn tables. And on one porch, a figure leans back in a chair that creaks with every shift of weight, watching the harbor settle. The water itself seems almost reluctant to sleep. Small ripples catch the fading light, each shimmer a reminder of ships that once crowded this very bay. Some came for trade, others for plunder. Some arrived under the king's flag, others under the black. To the woman resting on the porch this night, those ships are not distant history, but memories woven into the fabric of her youth. She remembers the sound of ropes tightening, the sudden bark of orders, the laughter of crews returning ashore with pockets jangling. And she remembers, too, the silences, those stretches of waiting when every rumor seemed heavier than fact. She closes her eyes for a moment, and the voices return. A barmaid's low Irish accent offering a drink on the house, a flamboyant laugh as a man in patched calico bursts through a tavern door. A hush of disbelief when a woman, dressed as a man, grips a cutlass with hands as sure as any sailor's. These are fragments of stories she once heard, tales that moved across Nassau like smoke from one lantern to the next. It is a curious thing how legends live not only in books, but in the half-remembered accounts shared on quiet nights. Blackbeard, for instance, is said to have tied burning fuses into his beard, letting the smoke curl around his head until he looked like a demon risen from the sea. Whether it was exactly true hardly mattered. What mattered was the impression that here was a man larger than fear itself. Yet even he, she recalls, ran aground. His great ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, broken upon a sandbar as surely as any common sloop. And what of Anne Bonny, the barmaid who was more than she seemed? She had walked through a tavern as if she owned it, her eyes sharp enough to weigh every man present. She kissed Jack Rackham before the crowd, but she also slipped aboard his ship dressed in men's garb, her cutlass ready, her pistol steady. In her, the townsfolk whispered, was proof that not all roles were as fixed as the crown decreed. Some claimed her temper was fiercer than Blackbeard's own. Others said she laughed at danger as if it were a dance partner. The woman on the porch smiles faintly at the memory. She has heard all these accounts, some firsthand, others exaggerated. She has weighed them as one might weigh gold coins, wondering which are true and which are gilded lies. Yet it is not accuracy that brings her peace tonight, but the act of remembering, the rhythm of stories that echo like lullabies across the years. The harbor grows quieter still. A gull cries once, then falls silent. Farther out, a lantern sways on the bow of a vessel moored against the tide. Its reflection shivers, as if uncertain whether to vanish or remain. And she thinks, perhaps that is what all stories are, reflections on dark water, shifting with every ripple, yet carrying a glow that keeps the night from swallowing all. Some stories carry a sharp edge, of betrayals whispered in alleys, of chains rattling in holds, of captains who surrendered while their women fought to the last breath. These, too, find their place in memory, though they sting like salt on raw skin. For even in a world lulled by the ordinary, the market stalls, the boat repairs, the laughter after rum, there was always the possibility of a turn, sudden and stark, like a tide pulling faster than expected. The chair creaks again as she leans forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She thinks of the little boy who once asked about pirates' treasure, about maps marked with an X. She had told him the truth, that treasure was rarely buried, more often squandered in taverns and markets. But she had also let him dream. For what harm is there in a child imagining gold beneath sand? Perhaps that is the real inheritance of such tales, not the gold itself, but the permission to imagine, to wonder. The evening air cools. Somewhere a shutter bangs softly, loose on its hinge. The woman pulls her shawl tighter and lets the hush deepen. Soon the stars will show, and with them the long stretch of night. In that stillness she knows the past and present blur. The porch becomes a quarterdeck, the lamplight a lantern swaying, the sigh of the tide a reminder of voices long gone but never entirely lost. And so the story begins again, as it always does, not with cannon fire or burning sails, but with a single listener, ready to lean closer to the quiet beat of history. A gentle wish hides beneath quiet hearts. Morning in the port does not begin with trumpets or bells. It begins with small sounds, boots scuffing against stone, shutters opening with a squeak, the low murmur of vendors arranging their wares. Sunlight creeps in slowly, brushing the tops of masts and gilding the water with faint gold, and within these ordinary motions lies a quiet undercurrent, a longing not spoken aloud. The people of a harbor town live close to the sea, but few of them ever name what it stirs inside. To some it is opportunity, a chance to ship out for wages or fortune. To others it is risk, a memory of storms that took husbands, sons, and brothers. Yet in almost everyone, there is the faintest flicker of something else, an unvoiced desire for freedom, or perhaps for escape. The sea, vast and untamed, makes such thoughts natural, but like a candle flame, they are often cupped carefully in the palm, kept hidden from the wind of daily duty. On this particular morning, the harbor breathes with both routine and restlessness. A baker carries loaves in a basket balanced on his hip, the crusts still steaming. Children chase one another across the docks, their bare feet quick on the planks. An old sailor sharpens a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the scrape ringing like a faint bell. And over all these movements hangs the scent of brine and fish, mingled with tar warmed by early sun. Within a tavern not far from the waterfront, another kind of waking takes place. The spyglass, as it is called, has seen its share of long nights. Mugs of rum drained, songs shouted, quarrels cooled only by exhaustion. By morning, the air inside is stale, carrying the sour tang of drink and smoke. But in a corner, a woman sets chairs upright, her hands practiced and brisk. Her name is Anne, though few call her that aloud here. Most see only the surface, a barmaid with sharp eyes and a manner half welcoming, half warning. She moves with purpose, but her thoughts drift. She remembers the feel of a cutlass grip, the weight of a pistol at her belt. Those memories stir an ache she rarely lets herself name. To work as a server, to pour drinks for sailors, is safe. But safety has never been her true wish. She longs for the deck of a ship, for the sting of salt on her face, for the chance to carve her place not as ornament, but as equal. Yet she speaks none of this. To voice it aloud would invite laughter, disbelief, or worse. So the wish remains tucked behind her, eyes revealed only in the sharpness of her gaze. Outside, in the market stalls, another figure hides her own secret. She goes by the name Mark, presenting herself as a wiry young man with cropped hair and quiet ways. She buys provisions carefully, flour, dried beans, a length of rope. To the vendors, she is simply another sailor preparing for a voyage. But within her chest beats the guarded heart of Mary Red, who has lived most of her life disguised as one of the opposite sex. For Mary, the disguise is not merely a mask, but a key, the only way to move freely in a world that denies her path. Yet even with the protection of her false name, she carries a hidden wish, to be seen as she truly is, and still accepted, still valued. That wish, too, stays unspoken, locked beneath the careful posture of a sailor going about her errands. Wishes, silent though they may be, shape the air of the harbor more than most realize. They are the undercurrent beneath the bustle. A fisherman casting his nets wonders if this will be the season he earns enough to repair his leaking roof. A dockhand longs to see another land before his back grows too bent. A merchant, adjusting the ledgers on his stall, dreams of a daughter's marriage secured by respectable wealth. None of them voice these hopes, but in the hush between sails and shouts, they hang like mist. And woven among these ordinary wishes is something sharper, more dangerous, the longing for freedom that piracy once promised. Though Governor Rogers has tried to scrub the island clean, though pardons have been offered and gallows built, the memory of Nassau's brief republic still lingers. Men recall the days when they voted as equals, when shares were counted fairly, when no captain ruled without consent. To some, that memory is a sting. To others, it remains a beacon. And so the wish for liberty, however faint, lives on in whispers. A passerby might not notice these longings. They are hidden in gestures. The way a man lingers too long staring at the horizon. The way a woman grips a mug with unnecessary force. The way children build boats from driftwood and send them skimming toward open sea. The harbor, on its surface, is ordinary. Beneath, it hums with quiet desire. Later that day, as the sun dips and shadows lengthen, Anne wipes her hands on her apron and steps outside the tavern. She watches the street fill with the returning tide of sailors. Some walk with the steady rhythm of men who know their trade. Others stagger, their laughter already thick with drink. And in their faces, Anne sees again what she does not name. Each one carries a private hunger, whether for coin, for respect, for adventure, or simply for another dawn. She draws her shawl around her shoulders and allows herself a moment of honesty. If she could wish aloud, she would ask not for safety, not for coin, but for the chance to stand on deck beside them, cutlass bared, her name carried not as barmaid, but as sailor. Yet even as she thinks this, she knows, the world does not grant such wishes easily. Farther down the lane, Mary, still marked to those around her, passes by, their paths not yet intertwined. She carries a sack of provisions, its weight pressing into her shoulder. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, scan the tavern door. For just an instant, the two women's gazes meet. Neither speaks, yet in that brief recognition lies something rare, the unspoken knowledge that each holds a wish the other understands. The town moves on. Bells mark the hour. A cart rattles past, its wheels leaving grooves in dust. Life appears unchanged, but beneath it all, those whispered longings remain, waiting for the moment when circumstance, fate, or sheer defiance will bring them to light. It is easy, in hindsight, to mark the turning points, to say, here is where the tide shifted, here is where the wish became action. But in the moment, no one knows. The quiet desire rests like an ember, unseen until the right breath of wind makes it glow. And so the day ends as it began, with small sounds. The harbor drinks in the fading light. A child is called indoors. A sailor tightens the rope on his berth. A woman closes the shutters of her tavern. Each act is ordinary, almost forgettable. Yet beneath each lies the secret hope that tomorrow or the day after, something might change. And when it does, history will call it fate, or defiance, or rebellion. But in truth, it begins here, in whispered longing, in unspoken desire, in the silent hearts of those who live at the water's edge. Morning trade hums with steady rhythms. The harbor wakes, not with fanfare, but with the patient rhythm of countless small labors. Long before the sun fully climbs, the air is already filled with motion. Merchants unfurl canvas awnings, shaking loose the dew. Fishermen, with nets still damp from the dawn's haul, trudge toward stalls where the day's bargaining will unfold. Women arrange baskets of fruit, bananas, plantains, and oranges bright as marigolds, while children, barefoot and laughing, dart among the tables, carrying messages or snatching quick tastes of sweetness when no one looks. The market is a living clock. Each sound marks the hour in ways more reliable than church bells. The scrape of barrels rolled across planks, the clink of coins weighed on scales, the call of vendors offering salted meat, flour, or molasses. Smoke rises from food sellers, roasting maize or frying plantain slices, the aroma drifting above the press of bodies. In this symphony of ordinary commerce lies the true heartbeat of Nassau. And yet, beneath the bustle, a tension hums, for the town has known sharper days. It remembers when pirate crews swaggered through these same lanes, their pockets heavy with stolen coin, their laughter too loud, their weapons never far from hand. Those days are fading, swept away by Rogers's new order, yet the memory lingers. Market folk glance twice at certain sailors, wondering if they once served under a black flag. A scar here, a tattoo there, a look too wary for honest trade. These are the hints that stir whispers. But no one says such things aloud, not in daylight, not in public. Anne walks among the stalls, a basket hooked on her arm. Her role here is plain, buying provisions for the tavern, but her eyes move with sharper purpose. She notices the way merchants lean close to share gossip, how their voices lower when the Navy's patrol passes. She sees the subtle exchange of a coin too heavy for its stated value, the kind of payment that suggests bribes more than sales. And she sees, too, the quiet longing on faces, the dockhand who studies a ship as if imagining escape, the young woman who lingers too long by a stall of foreign cloth, fingertips brushing silks she cannot afford. For Anne, the market is more than commerce. It is the stage where desires play out in the open, while truths stay hidden beneath. She feels at once part of it and apart from it, as though she moves in two worlds, the visible one of ordinary errands and the invisible one of restless dreams. Not far away, Mary, still cloaked in the identity of Mark, steps carefully through the throng. She carries herself with the unremarkable air of a sailor fetching supplies, but her eyes, like Anne's, are sharper than her disguise suggests. She listens as men talk of wages cut short, of ships confiscated, of governors who demand obedience, yet provide little protection. These murmurs feed her sense of unease. The sea once promised freedom, but the markets, with their ledgers and laws, remind her that freedom is being priced, taxed, and taken away. She buys what she needs: dried fish, a coil of rope, a tin of powder sealed against damp. Each purchase is made with care, her movement steady, her voice low. Few notice her, and that is how she prefers it, for now. But as she lifts the sack onto her shoulder, she cannot help but glance at Anne across the market. Their eyes meet again, as they had before. This time, the gaze lingers, subtle but sure, like the recognition of two candles catching each other's flame. The market itself does not pause for their meeting. Life rolls on. A boy drops a basket of limes, and green fruit scatter across the dirt. Shouts rise as vendors scold him, though others laugh and help gather the runaway pieces. A dog trots through the chaos tail high, scavenging what scraps he can. A fiddler sets up near the edge of the stalls, his bow coaxing a tune that weaves through the air, adding a lilting note to the clatter of trade. For those who watch closely, small dramas unfold at every corner. A merchant argues with a sailor over the price of canvas, the dispute softened only when the merchant's wife slips an extra length into the bundle, her eyes meeting the sailor's with a kindness her husband lacks. An old woman sits weaving baskets, her hands knotted with age, yet her movements sure and steady. She hums a tune older than the town itself, a lullaby from another shore, and children gather near her, drawn to the sound. And then there are the silent figures, men leaning against posts, their faces turned to shade, watching more than they speak. Some are informants, paid to report movement back to the governor. Others are former pirates who have not yet chosen a side between obedience and defiance. Their presence is a reminder that in Nassau, neutrality rarely lasts. By mid-morning, the heat thickens. The market grows louder, more insistent. Coins clink faster, voices rise higher, tempers flare. The small quiet wishes of dawn harden into sharper needs. Sailors grow impatient, merchants more demanding. Yet even in this press of business, the undercurrent of longing remains. It hums like the drone of insects, always there, never silenced. Anne pauses by a stall selling spices. Nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper sealed in glass jars. She lifts one, inhales the sharp fragrance, and feels a pang she cannot quite name. Perhaps it is memory of nights aboard ship when the scent of far-off lands drifted from cargo holds. Perhaps it is simply yearning for something beyond this ordinary morning. She sets the jar back carefully and moves on. Mary, meanwhile, takes shelter by a shaded wall, adjusting the sack on her shoulder. She watches the Navy patrol pass again, their boots striking the ground in rhythm. The sight tightens something inside her. These men, with their polished buttons and crisp uniforms, carry the weight of law. To most, they represent order. To Mary, they represent the cage she has spent her life avoiding. She turns away before her expression can betray her thoughts. As the sun climbs higher, a breeze stirs from the sea, carrying the cries of gulls. It shifts the market's scent, salt mingling with spices, sweat, and fruit. The people adjust their hats, fan themselves, or retreat briefly into shade. And in that moment of pause, when everyone slows to catch a breath, the longing grows more visible. It rests in faces, in posture, in the way eyes drift to the horizon. The market, for all its bustle, is not only a place of trade. It is a mirror. In it you can see hunger for bread and hunger for freedom. You can see coins exchanged for flour and glances exchanged for hope. You can see the surface order, and beneath it, the restless tide. By afternoon, the market begins to thin. Baskets grow lighter, barrels emptier. Merchants pack away their goods, children grow weary, sailors retreat to taverns with their earnings. Yet the undercurrent does not fade. It moves with them into narrow streets, into shaded rooms, into the corners of conversation where no official dares to listen. Anne returns to the spyglass with her basket, setting provisions in place for the evening crowd. Mary carries her sack aboard a small sloop, stowing it with quiet efficiency. To any onlooker, these are ordinary errands, unremarkable. But to those who feel the pulse beneath, they are steps in a larger rhythm, the rhythm of lives, poised between obedience and defiance. And so the market closes as it began, not with fanfare but with small sounds, the thud of shutters, the creak of carts, the sigh of waves beyond. Nassau sleeps lightly even in daylight, for it knows that longings whispered in morning can shape storms by night. Familiar hands keep the day in line. Routine has a way of smoothing the rough edges of any place, even a port that has known wild nights and sudden storms. When the morning market closes and the shouts fade, Nassau settles into the steady rhythm of midday. The sun climbs higher, pressing down with warmth that makes every sound seem slower, heavier. Doors creak as shutters are drawn to block the glare. Chickens scratch in shaded alleys. A dog curls beneath a cart, dozing. On the docks, men coil ropes with practiced ease. The ropes themselves are rough and salt-stiff, each line marked by countless hands. To an outsider, it may look like a thoughtless task, circling cord into neat loops, stacking it against a mast or piling it into the corner of a sloop. But for the men who do it, this is ritual. They know which coils must be kept loose, which lines must stay dry, which knots to leave for quick release if a ship is pressed to flee. It is routine, yes, but routine that may mean the difference between safety and disaster. Nearby, a cooper repairs a barrel, his hammer tapping out a rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Children pause to watch him fit the staves together, curious at how ordinary wood can be forced into a circle strong enough to hold water or rum. The cooper does not look up. He has done this work for years, long before pirates made Nassau infamous, and he will likely do it long after their names have faded. His labor is quiet, unseen by history, yet it sustains the very trade that gave birth to both merchants and outlaws alike. Inside the Spyglass Tavern, Anne wipes down tables, her cloth moving in circles over the wood. The scent of ale and smoke clings to her hands, but she hardly notices. She stacks mugs, checks the stock of rum, and sets bread to warm. These motions are ordinary, almost dull, but she finds a certain calm in them. Routine holds her steady, like a ship at anchor. And yet, beneath her calm, a restless energy stirs. She remembers another kind of rhythm. The thud of boots rushing to a gun deck, the call and answer of orders in the heat of a chase. That memory flickers, but she buries it, finishing her task before it can take hold. Outside, Mary, still living under the name Mark, tends to small repairs on the sloop William. She tightens a line here, checks a knot there, her movements methodical. To the rest of the crew, she is just another sailor, her wiry frame bent to the work. But to Mary, each knot tied is a shield. Every small act of seamanship proves she belongs, that she is not merely tolerated, but needed. Her disguise may hide her true self, yet her skill keeps the disguise from being questioned. Routine, for her, is armor. The town itself hums with these small acts. A seamstress mends a shirt with careful stitches, her needle flashing in the light. A boy sweeps the steps outside a shop, his broom pushing dust into the street where it scatters on the breeze. A clerk scratches figures into a ledger, pausing only to dip his quill in ink. These are not the stories told in taverns, but they are the threads that bind a community. Still, routine carries its own quiet surprises. A slip of the hand leaves a sailor with a cut finger, and Anne, passing by, presses a cloth to the wound with a firmness that startles him. He had expected laughter or mockery, but she offers only a steady look, neither gentle nor cruel, simply matter of fact. He mutters thanks, and she moves on. It is a small moment, easily forgotten, yet in it lies something rare, the reminder that care can be as quick and unadorned as violence. The hours pass slowly. Heat shimmers above the roofs, making the air waver. In the shade of a wall, two men play dice, their voices low. One wins a small pile of coins, but instead of boasting, he simply gathers them and leaves, his face unreadable. Perhaps he has debts to settle. Perhaps he has plans to slip away on the next tide. Routine does not strip life of mystery. It only hides it under quieter layers. At the shipyard, hammers ring as a carpenter fits a new plank to a hull. Sawdust drifts on the breeze, mixing with salt. The smell is sharp, almost sweet. The carpenter pauses to wipe his brow, then returns to the work. Each strike of the mallet is steady, deliberate. He has done this countless times, yet today he feels the faint unease that comes from rumors. Whispers of the Navy's increased presence, of men being questioned, of names appearing on lists. He says nothing, for such talk draws attention, but he works faster, as if by finishing this ship, he might outrun the change bearing down. Routine, in this way, is both comfort and illusion. It gives the sense of stability, but everyone knows it can shatter in an instant. A single cannon shot, a sudden betrayal, a storm at sea. These are enough to break the pattern. That knowledge hangs in the air like humidity, unspoken but felt. As the afternoon lengthens, Anne steps outside the tavern and finds herself watching the docks. She sees men lounging on barrels, their laughter low and tired. She sees Mary, Mark, moving with a sailor's grace, checking lines as if the sloop were already preparing to sail. And she feels, for just a heartbeat, the pull of something beyond her routine. The memory of a cutlass in her hand returns sharper, clearer. She can almost feel the leather grip, hear the hiss of steel drawn. But then a voice calls her name, and she blinks, turning back to the tavern. She answers without hesitation, her face calm, her routine intact. Evening draws near, and the town exhales. Merchants close their stalls, workers return home. The tide carries the scent of the sea deeper inland, and Nassau, for all its history, looks like any other town settling into the quiet of night. The routines hold, the threads remain unbroken. But within those threads, small knots of tension and longing wait. The harbor is never still for long. Notices whisper of law and gallows. By the time evening shadows lengthen across Nassau, The ordinary rhythms of work have begun to fold into something less visible, more uneasy. The harbor still smells of salt and fish, and voices still rise from taverns with the usual laughter, but woven through the soundscape is a quieter strain, a murmur of worry, a hush of expectation. For though sails still fill the bay and carts still rattle across cobblestones, the island breathes under pressures no one names aloud. On the plaster walls near the governor's residence, new sheets of parchment hang heavy with wax seals. They ripple faintly in the breeze, edges curling with damp. The bold black letters announce what every man, woman, and child in Nassau already knows, that piracy is a crime against the crown, punishable by death. Beneath the broad declaration lie the details, rewards for information, sums for capture, promises of pardon for those who surrender quickly. The words are plain, but their presence on the wall is like a shadow cast across the whole settlement. Every passerby glances, few linger. A mother pulls her child closer as they walk past. A sailor, once bold, quickens his step. The paper does not shout, yet it weighs heavier than cannon fire. Governor Woodes Rogers has made his mark on Nassau. Where once the town thrived as a republic of rogues, now order presses down, measured in gallows and decrees. At the edge of the settlement, wooden beams rise stark against the sky, gallows newly built, their timbers still smelling of pitch. They stand not merely as instruments, but as warnings, silhouettes visible from the harbor. Sailors returning from voyages cannot fail to notice them. Their message is simple: the age of impunity is over. Yet for all this outward show of strength, the true pressure works in silence. Former pirates, now pardoned, try to make their lives anew as farmers, fishermen, or laborers. But suspicion clings like smoke. A scar across the cheek, a tattoo of crossed pistols, a story told too vividly in rum-soaked conversation. Any of these can draw the wrong kind of attention. A man who once swaggered down the street now lowers his head. A woman who once poured drinks for outlaws watches her tongue, measuring every word. Nassau has not forgotten, and Rogers has not forgiven. Anne sees it in the tavern each night. Men drink more quietly now, laughter edged with caution. Dice clatter, but bets are smaller. Songs are sung, but fewer voices join. From time to time, she notices eyes flick toward the door whenever it opens, as though every arrival might be a patrolman in plain clothes. She pours drinks, clears mugs, wipes tables, and listens, always listening. The tavern air carries more than the scent of ale. It carries unease. Mary, still Mark in the eyes of her shipmates, feels the pressure aboard the William. Once, crews spoke freely of prizes taken, of narrow escapes, of raids planned with daring. Now, conversations are hushed, careful. Men who once boasted of their courage glance over shoulders, weighing which comrade might whisper their names to the governor. Loyalty, once the lifeblood of a pirate crew, frays under the weight of suspicion. And yet, the silence itself becomes dangerous. Words unspoken grow heavy. Men begin to imagine betrayals that may not exist, to suspect treachery where none is present. A friend's pause before answering, a captain's glance too sharp, a woman's smile too brief, all can be read as signs. Nassau, under Rogers's rule, has become a place where silence speaks louder than sound. The notices on the walls do their work. Each one offers pardon to those who surrender quickly. Each one promises coin to those who inform. And so every man is tempted, every woman tested. Who among them will hold steady? Who will choose safety over loyalty? Who will trade a comrade's name for a handful of silver? These are questions that no one asks aloud, but everyone feels. In the market, Two fishermen argue over the price of saltfish. Their voices rise sharp, but beneath the quarrel lies something else. Each wonders whether the other has seen his name written, whether the other might carry tales to the governor. They end the argument quickly, coins changing hands, eyes avoiding contact. Better not to risk words. Better to keep quarrels shallow, routine, forgettable. At the shipyard, a carpenter hears rumors while fitting a plank. He leans close to a fellow worker, voice low, saying he has heard the Navy is sending more sloops, that Rogers means to scour not just Nassau, but every inlet from here to Tortuga. His companion only nods, not daring to reply. Even agreement feels dangerous. The sound of the mallet fills the silence. And at the tavern, Anne notices new faces, men in plain coats, not ragged enough for sailors, not fine enough for merchants. They drink little, watch much, and ask questions with a casual air that feels too practiced. Informants, perhaps, or perhaps merely cautious travelers. One cannot be sure, and that uncertainty is itself a pressure. Mary senses it too when she returns from errands. Men speak more softly around her, some clapping her on the back with too much force, as if to prove camaraderie. Others avoid her eyes, their silence stiff. She knows the risk of exposure is not only that her true self might be revealed, but that any difference at all could make her a target. In a world where suspicion is currency, the smallest crack invites danger. So she holds her posture firm, keeps her voice low, and hides her thoughts deeper than ever. The gallows stand empty for now, but their presence shapes every choice. It is said that men fear rope more than powder. A cannonball kills swiftly, but a hanging works slowly, each day drawing closer, each step more deliberate. The very slowness is its cruelty. And Nassau, seeing the beams rise, feels that slowness in its bones. Even those with no connection to piracy cannot escape the weight. A mother, tucking her child into bed, wonders whether the stories she tells should avoid mention of sea adventures, lest they plant dangerous dreams. A priest delivering a sermon chooses his words with care, speaking of sin in broad terms, but avoiding mention of lawless seas. A shopkeeper counts his coins twice, not from greed, but from fear that a missing piece might draw unwelcome notice. Silent pressures are like tides, always moving, rarely seen, impossible to resist. They shape the harbor more than storms, more than trade. They carve channels in the mind, forcing thought into narrower courses. And so, the evening deepens. The spyglass fills again with sailors, their laughter muted, their mugs emptied faster than before. Anne pours, listens, and wonders how long such tension can hold before it snaps. Mary, aboard the William, sharpens her knife in steady strokes, each scrape a quiet defiance against the silence pressing in. Outside, the gallows creak faintly in the wind, timbers settling as though eager for their first weight. Nassau sleeps, but lightly, for in every silence lies the whisper of law, and in every shadow stands the shape of gallows. Narrow paths close as choices fade. By the time another dawn washes Nassau in pale light, the air feels heavier, as if the very sky is pressing down. The routines continue. Gulls wheel over the harbor. Fishermen pull their nets. Children chase one another across sun-warmed planks. Yet for many, the sense of narrowing possibility hangs in every breath. Choices, once abundant, seem fewer each day. There was a time when a man could step into a tavern and choose to join a crew bound for Cuba, to gamble his coin in a dice game, to vanish into an alley with promises of easy fortune. There was a time when women, too, might make bold choices, whether to serve, to travel, or to disguise themselves and claim what was denied them. But now, under the watchful eyes of Rogers and his men, each choice carries more weight, more risk. At the edge of the harbor, the gallows rise like wooden fingers pointing skyward. The beams are bare this morning, but the threat they hold is constant. Those who once laughed at the crown's laws must now reckon with them. A sailor standing before the tavern door mutters to his friend, "Better a plow than a rope." His friend shakes his head, answering, "Better the sea than both." Such exchanges are brief, hushed, but they reveal the narrowing paths left to men whose lives once stretched wide across the horizon. Anne feels this weight as she ties on her apron. She pours drinks, wipes tables, sets bread to warm. Each movement is ordinary, yet within her chest grows the certainty that her choices are slipping away. To remain a barmaid is to live small, contained, her spirit pressed flat against 4 tavern walls. To return to sea is to risk rope and gallows, to risk being remembered not as fierce or free, but as condemned. Yet what other choice is there for a woman like her, whose blood quickens only when sails billow and waves crash? Mary, still hidden within her mask as Mark, faces her own narrowing. Each day she binds herself tighter within the role of sailor, speaking little, moving carefully, concealing the truth that pulses within. To reveal herself would be to risk ruin, to be cast aside, mocked, or worse. To maintain the disguise is to continue living half a life, seen but not known. Yet, as she watches the patrols move along the docks, she realizes even that disguise may not be enough. The crown hunts pirates of any face, any name. Her secret, carefully guarded, offers no shield from the noose. In the market, merchants tally coins more slowly. Some consider leaving Nassau altogether, retreating to quieter islands where the law's hand is lighter. But travel itself is risk. Every sloop might be searched, every passenger questioned, and so many remain, caught between the desire to flee and the fear of leaving. Choices narrow not only for pirates, but for everyone who lives in a place once called free. At the shipyard, a young carpenter listens as older men speak in half sentences. They talk of Roberts, who still sails, of Vane, who refuses to bow, of rumors that Blackbeard himself was seen in the Carolinas. The carpenter knows these are only fragments of truth, carried by rumor and rum. But he listens all the same, for they suggest another choice, that of defiance. Perhaps, he thinks, there is still room for courage. Yet when he glances toward the gallows, his stomach turns, and he returns to his work. Anne, finishing her errands, passes by the governor's notice board. Another parchment hangs, fresh and unweathered. It lists the names of men marked for capture. Jack Rackham among them, his flamboyant calico coat described in detail, a bounty attached to his head. She reads silently, her face calm, but inside her chest something stirs. Fear, yes, but also defiance. Rackham is no Blackbeard, no towering legend, yet he has chosen to return to sea after accepting pardon. That act alone makes him both reckless and brave. Later, in the tavern's shadowed corner, she overhears 2 sailors argue over his fate. One insists Rackham is a fool, that no small sloop can outrun the Navy forever. The other shakes his head, claiming Rackham sails not for fortune, but for freedom. That his crew votes, his shares are fair, his heart loyal. Their voices rise, then drop again when they notice Anne nearby. She offers no opinion, but she listens, and the thought lingers. What would it mean to choose his path, narrow though it is? Mary feels the same pull when she hears whispers aboard the William. Rackham plans a new course, perhaps toward Cuba, where Spanish ships still sail fat with goods. The risk is high, but the promise of plunder is real. Yet more than coin, it is the chance to choose a life not dictated by Rogers's parchments, not measured by gallows. She sharpens her knife, watching sparks fly from the whetstone, and thinks, perhaps narrow choices are not always prisons. Sometimes they are doors. Still, not all feel the same. In back alleys, men slip away to meet with informants, trading names for silver. In kitchens, women fold their hands and pray for husbands to abandon the sea, to take the plow, to choose survival over legend. In barracks, soldiers laugh over mugs of beer, confident that the rope will claim its due. The town holds its breath, caught between fear and defiance. Night falls, and the gallows loom darker than ever. Lanterns swing, their light catching on the beams. From the tavern window, Anne watches them. She knows their presence is meant to close doors, to force obedience. But in her chest, she feels the opposite. A push, a fire, a hunger to claim the narrow path of her choosing. She pours another drink, wipes another table, but her eyes drift back to the gallows, and her jaw tightens. Mary, walking the deck of the William beneath a silvered moon, feels the same. She grips the rail, the wood worn smooth beneath her palm, and breathes in the salt wind. Her choices are few: remain silent, remain hidden, or step forward into the risk of being truly seen. The sea offers no guarantees, but it offers movement, and movement is better than suffocation. She lifts her gaze to the stars and lets the thought settle like an anchor. Better a narrow path walked boldly than a wide one lived in chains. And so Nassau drifts into sleep, though lightly, uneasily. The gallows wait, the parchments whisper, the sea calls. The choice is narrow, but for those who dare, the narrowing becomes focus. Tomorrow may bring rope, or it may bring freedom. No one can know. But tonight, in the hush between waves and wind, hearts beat faster at the thought of choosing it all. A stranger's gaze carries hidden strength. Even in a town worn thin by law and caution, the tavern remained a stage where all manner of people passed through. Sailors with the look of salt still in their hair, merchants with ledgers tucked under their arms, even soldiers when the night grew bold enough. Yet every so often, someone would step through the door who did not fit easily into any of these molds. On this evening, as lanterns swayed and the smell of spilled rum lingered in the air, Anne noticed one such figure. She had been wiping the rim of a mug with her cloth, moving with the practiced motions of habit, when the door creaked and a cool draft swept in. At first, it was nothing unusual, just another arrival. But the hush that followed was subtle, as though the room itself had taken notice. The woman wore her auburn hair pulled back tightly, no loose strands softening her features. Her eyes, gray-green in the shifting light, missed nothing. They traveled the room with a deliberate sweep, not darting nervously, but weighing, measuring. She carried herself not with the slouch of a weary sailor, nor the stiff pride of a soldier, but with something else, something taut, alert, and quietly sure of its place. Anne could not place her at first. Familiar, yes, though where and how escaped her memory. Perhaps it was the cadence of her movement, the way she leaned against the bar without effort, as if she had done so 100 times before. Or perhaps it was simply that kind of presence, rare enough to make the ordinary seem charged. She ordered a drink in a voice touched with Ireland, the vowels softened but edged with steel. When Anne slid the mug across, the stranger met her eyes. For the briefest moment, Anne felt as though she were the one being measured, weighed, judged. And then, just as quickly, the stranger's gaze softened into something almost kind. Around them, the tavern resumed its rhythm. Dice rattled, laughter rose, chairs scraped. Yet Anne carried the impression with her, like the aftertaste of strong liquor, burning, undeniable, impossible to forget. It was Fletcher, ever nosing where stories might be found, who gave shape to Anne's hunch. He appeared at her elbow later that night, his cup already drained, and nodded toward the stranger now speaking with a cluster of men. "That's no mere barmaid," he muttered, his words slurred yet earnest. "That one has sailed, mark me. You can see it in her stance." Anne said nothing. She had seen enough sailors swagger to know most claimed more than they had earned. Yet she watched, and the more she did, the more Fletcher's claim rang true. The woman's hands bore calluses too deep for soft trade. Her shoulders, though narrow, carried the easy strength of someone who had hauled ropes, pulled lines, braced against wind. She laughed at something one of the men said, but even her laughter carried weight, as though she offered it deliberately, not freely. When at last she moved away from the group, passing Anne again, she leaned close enough to murmur, "On the house, was it? That's kind." The words were plain, but the look in her eyes lingered, half challenge, half gratitude, and Anne, who had learned long ago to guard her heart with sharpness, felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Recognition. By the time the door banged open and Calico Jack Rackham strode in, coat patched and smile wide, the tavern was once again filled with motion. He called out to "Anne, darling," and swept her into his orbit with theatrical charm. But Anne, bonny now, pirate's consort, and more than that, cast one last glance toward the stranger before letting herself be carried away. That look held promise, warning, and the kind of kinship forged not in words but in shared defiance. Days later, the docks themselves bore witness to what the tavern had only hinted. Rackham's sloop returned from a raid, sails patched but proud, her crew loud with triumph. Men spilled onto the quay carrying sacks of sugar, casks of rum, bolts of cloth, and there, among them, was the stranger once more, but not as consort, not as hidden watcher. She walked down the gangplank in men's clothing, a cutlass at her hip, a pistol in her belt. Her scarf bound her hair, her boots struck the planks with the assurance of belonging. The calluses on her hands were no longer quiet hints, but badges displayed openly. She was no visitor to piracy. She was part of it. "Anne Bonny," Fletcher whispered at Anne's side, as though naming a ghost. "Fights better than most, they say." A temper that could shame Blackbeard himself, Anne did not answer. She only watched as the woman, Anne Bonny, barmaid turned pirate, or perhaps pirate all along, moved among the crew, shoulders squared, head high. For a moment, their eyes met again across the crowd, and in that silent recognition was the truth. Here was someone who refused to shrink into the narrow roles the world had laid out. Later, as night fell and music rose from the taverns, stories already spread of her temper, her courage, her defiance. Some scoffed. A woman with a cutlass, what nonsense. Others swore they had seen her strike a man down without hesitation. Whether true or embellished, the difference was undeniable. She had stepped beyond the ordinary, and in doing so, she unsettled the very air of Nassau. Silent skill marks one set apart. The docks were never truly still. Even at night, the water slapped softly against hulls, ropes groaned as ships shifted with the tide, and somewhere in the distance a gull cried out as though refusing to rest. Yet for all this low murmur, the docks carried a different rhythm in daylight, measured, deliberate, watchful. It was in this rhythm that Mark lived, the quiet sailor with cropped hair and wiry frame who moved through each task with a steadiness that drew little attention but never failed to earn respect. Mark mended lines with swift, precise motions, hands sure on knots that others fumbled. Mark carried barrels with a wiry strength that surprised heavier men. Mark spoke little, but when a word was offered, it was measured, apt, and without waste. To the Williams crew, Mark was simply another man of skill, young, perhaps, but seasoned in ways that defied easy explanation. Few questioned him. Few asked from where he had come. In a town where stories could prove dangerous, silence was the surest defense. But behind the mask of Mark lived Mary Red, a woman who had worn this disguise since girlhood. Her life had been a patchwork of shifting identities, first as a boy to claim a mother's inheritance, later as a soldier in foreign wars, and now as a pirate among men who never guessed her truth. To shed the mask now would be unthinkable. Too much depended on it. Not only survival, but the fragile freedom it allowed. Each morning, as Mary bound her chest and wrapped her scarf, she felt the weight of the choice she was not deceiving out of whimsy or play. She was defending her right to stand among sailors as their equal, to claim the same work, the same risks, the same share of freedom. And though the disguise was tiring, it was also armor. With it, she was not mocked as an oddity nor dismissed as decoration. She was measured by skill alone, and in skill she never faltered. Still, masks carry their own strain. To remain always silent, always guarded, is to live half seen. At night, when the crew sang shanties loud with rum, Mary sometimes let her voice join in, lower than her natural pitch, steady enough to blend. But in those moments, a longing pressed in her chest, not for gold or plunder, but for recognition, to be seen not only as capable, but as herself. The Williams crew came to trust Mark in subtle ways. When a gun jammed, Mark was the one they called to clear it. When a fight broke out over shares, Mark's sharp word was enough to cool tempers. When storms pressed the sloop hard against the wind, Mark's hands on the lines seemed always to steady the course. Trust, once earned, held. And so no one thought to question the quiet figure who asked little, gave much, and moved like a man with nothing to prove. Anne noticed, though. From the first moment she glimpsed Mark across the tavern, she had seen something in the way those gray eyes swept the room. They carried the same readiness she herself had cultivated, the same unwillingness to be dismissed. In battle, too, Anne observed. Mark's strikes were clean, efficient, unshowy, but behind them was a lifetime of discipline. It was not only strength, it was skill honed sharp. One evening, as the William drifted at anchor after a raid, Anne approached where Mark sat sharpening a knife. The scrape of metal on stone filled the silence. Anne leaned against the rail, her hair loose in the night breeze. "You fight as though it's second nature," she said softly. Mark did not look up. "Practice." The answer was curt, the mask intact. Anne studied the profile in the lantern light, the sharp line of jaw, the hands steady on the blade. She recognized the deflection, the way truth was folded tight beneath plain words. But she let it be. She knew the weight of secrets, and she knew the cost of pressing too hard. Instead, she offered a small smile. Whatever the reason, I'd not choose another at my side. For a moment, Mark's sharpening slowed. A flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, or relief, crossed the face turned toward the knife. Then the rhythm resumed, steady as before. The mask held, but behind it, Anne felt, lived a heart that understood exactly what had been spoken. The wider crew, of course, told stories. They liked to guess at Mark's past. Some said he had served in the British Army. Others claimed he was Dutch. Still others insisted he had once been a mercenary on the continent. Each tale grew taller with rum, but none drew close to the truth. Mary listened to these with a faint smile hidden in her mug. Better they guess wildly than know plainly. But secrecy carried danger. The more she proved herself, the more she stood apart. Men respected her, yes, but they also watched her. Why did Mark never speak of family? Why did he avoid the brothels in port? Why did his eyes, in unguarded moments, carry a depth more often seen in women burdened with too much too young? Questions buzzed, though none dared voice them aloud. Mary felt it, the fragile edge of discovery. Each day her mask held, but each day it risked slipping. And yet, she would not abandon it. For to walk openly as Mary was to invite chains or ridicule. To walk as Mark was to carve a place, however narrow, on the deck of a ship that sailed free. And so, she held her silence. She honed her skills. She became indispensable. And in that very indispensability lay both her shield and her trap. To be valued was to be watched. To be trusted was to be tested. Every nod of respect, every clap on the back, bound her tighter into a life lived half revealed. Anne, watching, understood more than most. She knew the strain of wearing a face the world would accept while hiding the fire that truly burned. And in Mary, she saw not only a comrade, but a reflection. A different mask, perhaps, but a mask all the same. In Nassau, where gallows loomed and laws pressed close, both women knew. Survival was not only about cutlasses and cannons. It was about carrying masks with patience, strength, and silence. And though silence can feel like solitude, sometimes, when another carries the same burden, it becomes something else. Something like kinship. Small mercies soften the harshest hours. The life of a port town is not measured only in noise and quarrel. Between the hammering of shipwrights and the shouts of sailors, there are softer intervals, moments that slip quietly into memory, though they rarely appear in tavern tales. In these hours, when the heat wanes and shadows lengthen, Nassau shows a gentler face. Children chase after each other along the beach, their laughter skipping like stones across the water. A woman pauses from hanging laundry to offer a crust of bread to a boy who lingers near, clearly hungry but too proud to beg. An old sailor, his hands scarred and twisted, guides a younger man in the art of splicing rope, his voice low and patient, his movements slow but exact. Such moments rarely draw notice, yet they hold the threads of mercy that bind a place together. For in a world heavy with law and gallows, the smallest kindness can feel like rebellion. Anne, standing in the doorway of the tavern, sees it more than most. She watches a beggar outside pause to share his meager scraps with a stray dog. She hears one sailor, drunk but not cruel, sing softly to himself a lullaby he must have learned as a child. She notices the way another steadies his companion who stumbles, leading him gently rather than mocking his weakness. These are not grand acts, but they soothe the harshness of days filled with suspicion and fear. Anne herself is not immune to such mercies. When she brings a mug to a sailor whose hands tremble from too much drink, she sets it down with a nod rather than a sneer. When a coin falls short, she sometimes pretends not to notice. It is not that she has softened. Her temper is still quick, her defiance intact, but rather that she knows too well the cost of cruelty. In small mercies, she finds a balance, a way to keep her own spirit from turning brittle. Mary, Mark to the crew, knows this too. Aboard the William, Harshness is often necessity. Food must be rationed, discipline maintained, weapons kept sharp. Yet, even here, small mercies surface. A man offers the last of his tobacco to another with shaking hands. A young sailor, seasick and pale, finds a blanket quietly placed beside him. A loaf, slightly larger than another's, is split without word. For Mary, whose life has been a long series of masks and hardships, such mercies strike deep. They remind her that not all bonds are forged in battle or sealed in blood. Some are woven in quiet gestures, in the simple acknowledgement of another's struggle. She accepts them rarely, but she notices always. And sometimes, when no one looks, she returns them. An extra turn at the pump so another can rest. A sharp word deflected before it sparks a fight. A steadying hand offered under the guise of rough camaraderie. One evening, when the ship drifts at anchor and the men gather to share rum, a quarrel begins. Harsh words rise, fists tighten. Mary steps between them, her posture calm, her voice low. "Enough," she says, just that one word. And for reasons even they cannot name, the men relent. Later, one of them leaves a slice of preserved fruit at her place. A silent thanks, unnoticed by others. Mary eats it slowly, tasting not the sweetness alone, but the mercy it carries. The island itself holds mercies too, if one has eyes to see. A sudden rain shower cools the heat of day. A breeze lifts the stench of fish from the market, carrying instead the clean salt of open sea. The moon rises full, laying a silver path across the water, reminding even the most weary that beauty still dwells in the world. Such things do not erase hardship, but they soften it, like cloth wrapped around a blade. It was during one such moment of mercy that Anne and Mary found themselves standing side by side, though neither had intended it. A fight had broken out near the docks, words slung too sharply, pride pricked too deeply. Anne, passing by, saw a sailor pinned against the wall, another's knife pressing close. For a breath, she felt the old fury rise in her chest. She might have stepped in with her own blade. But before she moved, Mary was already there. Mary's hand rested on the hilt of her pistol, her stance casual, but her eyes cold. "Let him go," she said quietly. There was no shout, no flourish, only certainty. And the man obeyed. The knife lowered, the tension broke, and the sailor slid free, clutching his side but alive. Anne met Mary's gaze then. No words passed, but the recognition was clear. Both knew the taste of fury, both knew the cost of cruelty, and both chose in that moment restraint. It was not weakness, it was mercy, and mercy requires its own kind of strength. Later that night, in the tavern, Anne found herself pouring a drink for Mary. She set it down without comment. Mary nodded once, her eyes steady. It was a small exchange, unnoticed by others, but for them it was enough. These mercies, crumbs of bread shared, quarrels stilled, knives lowered, did not make Nassau safe. The gallows still loomed, the governor's parchments still whispered, and betrayal still stalked the alleys. Yet they made life bearable. They reminded those who lived under constant threat that humanity was not wholly lost, that kindness could exist even where law and cruelty pressed hardest. And in such mercies lay something more dangerous than defiance: hope. For hope, once kindled, refuses to die quietly. Fair rules steady restless hearts. The cove lay quiet as a held breath. Moonlight silvered the low water and ran soft along the William's hull, and the ship answered with the smallest sounds, the hitch of a line, the hush of canvas furled tight, the mild creak of timbers settling after a day's work. On shore, mangroves kept their own counsel. Far out, A deeper darkness marked the open sea. It was a night for steady hands, not bold gestures. Lanterns were hooded and dim, the better to keep the cove a secret. On deck, the crew gathered in a loose half-circle around a makeshift table, 2 barrels with a door laid over them, planed smooth enough for a quill to find its way. A clay ink pot sat near a candle stub, and beside it a folded sheet of thick paper, edges pressed flat, as if to signal the seriousness of what it would carry. "Articles," Rackham said, letting the word stand like a small mast in the silence. He had pulled his gaudier patches to the back of his coat for once. The calico, less a banner, more a memory. "We sail lighter if the law among us is heavier. Best to set it clear before the wind turns." No one laughed at that, though a few mouths softened. The men, and those counted as men, shifted closer. Fletcher, who had rejoined with caution and a newly careful tongue, 2 lads barely into their beards, a cook whose ladle had steadied as many nerves as rum, the gunner who slept with one ear to the swell, Anne with her hair wrapped and her posture easy, Mark quiet as always, the knife at his belt reflecting a breath of lantern light. The quartermaster, a square man with steady eyes, rapped knuckles once on the door's edge. "Plainly, then," he said, "a ship may outrun a frigate and still be wrecked by quarrel. So we write what holds us level." He looked at the paper as though it were a shoreline the crew must sound before entering. "Shares to be, counted fair, votes taken on matters not of battle, punishment temperate, mercy not far behind." He turned the page so the blank faced them all. The quiet deepened. Somewhere beyond the cove, a night bird called, thin and sweet. "Speak it, not as brag, but as bond," Anne said, voice low. "We've all seen what comes of captains who rule like kings." Rackham's mouth twitched, not at her, but at the memory passing through the deck like a shadow. "Aye," he agreed, and that was all he said of other men's legends. So they began, not with fine phrases, but with steady ones. "A man, or crew member," said the quartermaster, glancing once toward Anne with a brief nod, "would have a vote in courses and prizes. In battle, the captain's word would be law until the guns went cold. Shares to be laid out by measure. The captain, a larger piece for the weight of his risk. The quartermaster a portion to match his reckonings. The gunner a bit more for the powder he tended, and each hand an honest turn. Then the rules that made a deck livable. No striking a comrade in hot blood. Cool first, then speak, and if needed, appeal to the whole. No stealing from a mate's bag, not a button nor a bit of tobacco. A small theft rots a large trust. Gambling to be kept modest under the awning, never on watch, never with knives too near. The Sabbath, if such a day could be found at sea, to be given a little more quiet. Tools stowed, tempers stilled. A deck scrub can wait until Monday if a man's lungs are raw from the week. "Compensation," said the quartermaster, tapping the paper. "Losses paid not in pity, but in justice. An arm, a leg, a hand, named and valued. A share set aside for any man downed in our cause. Numbers were offered, haggled gently, and set. Not a fortune, but enough to say, your pain will not be counted as nothing." Then came a clause that sailed slower, as if tacking into a contrary wind. "Women and boys," someone muttered. Ships that kept order most strict on that score ran easier. Eyes flicked toward Anne, then away. Mark's face did not move, but the angle of the shoulders changed, as if listening with the whole body. It was Rackham, for all his splash of color, who kept the tone even. "Most rules are made against abuses, not against what's well-governed," he said. "We've less trouble with Anne than we have with 3 men I could name, and won't." The corners of a few mouths lifted again. If a soul pulls her, its weight. The articles may name conduct, not category. The quartermaster set it down slow. No person aboard to be treated as prize or plaything. No threats, no forcing, no pulling rank by strength alone. Affections, if any, kept discreet and never at the cost of duty. The ship no stage for cruelty. Cruelty a fast way to lose your share and your place. A murmur ran around the half-circle, and something cramped in the air loosened, like a too-tight rope paid out a little. Mark's gaze lowered to the plank seam by his boot and steadied there. Anne's eyes were soft and flinty at once, as a whetstone is. They went on, captives to be spared when surrendering. No fire set that would burn men needlessly with cargo. No drunkenness on watch. No powder wasted for fancy. When the list felt level, the quartermaster smoothed it with his palm, the way a carpenter tests a board for hidden warps. So, he said, we set our own keel. The candle had guttered almost to nothing. A moth circled it once and fled the heat. The men shifted, eased shoulders, drew closer to the lamplight and the paper that would hold them to their better selves. Signing took longer than the writing. Not because there were many words, but because each man weighed his name, as if his hand could feel through the quill the weight of rope and the lift of wind hidden inside those strokes. Some could not write beyond the mark they'd learned as boys. The quartermaster guided their fingers, and next to a crooked X he said each name fair, not to shame, but to keep remembrance. The first signatures were the expected ones: captain, quartermaster, gunner. Then others stepped forward, unhurried, in no fixed order. The cook with flour in the creases of his knuckles, the top man with rope burn like a map of old work, the youngest lad, who swallowed and made his mark a heartbeat longer than needed, as if to make it last. Anne did not hesitate. She leaned her weight lightly on the makeshift table, signed with a sure hand, then set the quill down, as if returning a blade to its sheath. When she stepped aside, she did not look around to collect impressions. She looked out over the dark cove, reading the night like a chart. Mark stood a moment longer apart. The paper was not far, yet it seemed to meet him halfway. The face gave nothing, but something quieter happened. The shoulders softened by a thread. A breath went out slowly, a decision unknotted. Mark stepped in, took the quill, and made a neat workman's mark, neither flourish nor apology. The quartermaster wrote the name beside it, Mark, plain as a bell note, and that was that. No one clapped. No one spoke. The quiet itself felt like consent, the kind that does not need witness. When the paper had gathered all its names, the quartermaster sanded the wet ink and blew gently, then folded the sheet along smart creases and slid it into an oilskin case. We keep it near the powder, he said, because it may yet save us faster than the guns. He tapped the case once, almost a salute. Rackham unhooded the lantern a fraction, letting its little sun brighten the deck. You've signed to more than rule, he said. You've signed to memory. There are ports where no one will tell our story fair. There are books, maybe, to be written by men who never felt a deck buck under fire. Let them. His smile was small, tired, and oddly gentle. We'll be remembered here first. He rapped the oilskin with a knuckle. By our own hand. The men drifted to rail and coil and step, as men do after work well finished. Not to celebrate, not yet, but to test in their bodies the new balance. Voices rose, low and companionable, not for display, but for rest. A man laughed under his breath at something only he and the sea could hear. Another hummed the last line of a hymn and let it fade without shame. Anne took a place near the quarterdeck. the lamplight cutting her in half. One side shadow, one side gold. She felt the odd relief that comes when a tightly held thing is placed down among trusted hands. There would still be danger. There always was. But a fair share promised. A vote kept. A blow checked. That was a key slipped under every tongue. Mercy does not weaken a crew. It steadies it. Mark leaned by the shrouds, fingertips resting on a tarred line, as if to claim the ship through the skin. The disguise did not melt, nor did it need to. The articles had said, in their plain way, that skill and conduct would speak loudest. It was enough. In a world ruled by notices and gallows, being measured by one's work felt like a kind of amnesty. It would have been an easy night to pretend the world beyond the cove had softened, but the wind smelled the same. Salt, mangrove, a whisper of rain out past the bar. Somewhere a dog barked on shore, answered by another farther off. The crew's quiet held, not fragile, simply chosen. They had, each in his or her guarded way, signed to a better version of themselves. That is no small thing on any sea. By morning, the articles were not words, they were motion. The cove opened to a pale wash of day, and the William eased out on the tide like a thought made firm. The men moved as they had the day before, coiling, hauling, checking. But the rhythm had an extra stitch in it, the way a mended sleeve holds different from a torn one. You feel it only when you lift your arm, and the cloth answers clean. A test came small, not dramatic. They found a boat adrift a league out. 2 fishermen and a boy. Their skiff shipped green water, and the mast snapped short. The sea had not been cruel, merely careless, as seas are, and the men were not dying, only worn thin with bailing and hope. The articles had a line about captives and mercy. Fishermen were neither. But the spirit of the thing was clear, and the quartermaster leaned on it without a speech. "Hands to the skiff," he said, no trumpet in it. They brought the 3 aboard, water slopping onto the deck in a tired sheet, and let the boy sit by the sunny bit near the hatch where bare planks keep a secret warmth. Anne fetched a mug and doctored the water with a thumb of rum, not to dazzle, just to steady, and pressed a bit of saved bread into the boy's hand. He ate it like someone remembering how. A few men had been tense about time, which way the wind would lay later, what a delay here might cost there. But the ship itself seemed to breathe easier as the skiff rose higher, at the pump, and the fisherman's shoulders dropped an inch. When at last a spare spar was lashed as a jury mast, and a small sail bent to it, the quartermaster put a little food in a sack and tied it off on the thwart. "There," he said, "go you steady." No one cheered. No one needed to. The boy, face already bright with the thought of sun on his back and a clatter of oars on his own strand, let his eyes rest a second on Anne and then on Mark. Gratitude wants to speak, but sometimes the throat knows to spare it a form. He lifted his hand a little, as if testing the weight of thank you, and let it fall, lighter. By noon, another test, a misunderstanding over a coil, who had laid it where and why a man had tripped, the kind that used to flower into bruises or blood. This time, the 2 took breath and made their cases plain to the quartermaster. He listened, weighed, pointed to the new line inked last night. No striking in heat. "Right the coil," he said. "You," to the man who had wronged unintentionally, "mend it." "You," to the tripped one, "accept it mended." Both men's mouths opened, then closed. The coil was righted. The work went on. The deck held. The articles did not make saints. They rode alongside human nature, not above it. Voices still rose now and then. Cards still whispered under awnings. A man still found his way to sulk if sulking was his gift. But the course of quarrels shifted. A check here, a pause there, a path for anger to drain without drowning honor. It is a quiet engineering, justice, the placing of scuppers in just the right spots so a deck sheds water and keeps its footing. That evening, the cove far behind, the William trimmed for a reach. The light went the color of brass rubbed thin, and the sea took it in with a docile clink. Anne stood watching the horizon draw its clean line, and felt an inward steadiness match it. Rules written by others had never held her for long. These, written by hands she knew, did not bind so much as brace. Mark sat near the forward gun, oiling the swivel as if the iron could learn calm from the cloth. A man wandered up with a pipe and a story that refused to walk straight. Mark listened, not because the story was fine, but because listening had become part of the ship's grammar, a courtesy paid in small coin. When the pipe ember went out and the story finally found its end, the man looked lighter than when he'd sat down. "Harder seas ahead," Rackham said later, not as warning, but as weather. He stood by the wheel, one hand on the spoke, gaze testing the faint line where the night would undress the day. "All the better we know who we are." His voice held no sermon. A man who had been uncertain longer than he would admit had found a sentence he trusted. The articles lay below in their oilskin, ink dry, folds firm. They would not make a legend, not by themselves, but they would take the day's ordinary frictions and turn them, more often than not, into ways of moving instead of ways of breaking. On some shores, men call that law. At sea, it is something closer to kindness in harness, the yoke that keeps two animals from tearing one another when the hill grows steep. Night came slow, then all at once. A line of faint phosphor drew itself along the William's wake, little sea sparks answering the hull's passage with soft applause. The crew settled into watches. Voices fell to murmurs, and then to footfalls, and then to the kind of silence a ship chooses, not the kind forced upon it. What they had written in lamplight did not glitter. It would never be sung ashore by boys kicking up dust on a road, but it would hold when the wind backed and the sea made a fist. That is the quiet work of good rules, not to shout, but to keep the shouting from owning the room. Quiet trust grows where words are few. The days stretched longer now, each one draped in heat that shimmered above the water like a veil. On the William, sails snapped gently in the wind, not straining, not idle, but carrying the sloop in a steady rhythm that lulled even the most restless soul. Work was constant, of course. Ropes to coil, decks to scrub, casks to secure. But there was something in the pace that bred familiarity. Hands moved together without command. Eyes read each other's intent before a word was spoken. In this rhythm, bonds formed quietly. Not in grand declarations, nor in the clinking of mugs, but in the way one man reached to steady another when the deck pitched, or how Anne's laughter, rare but genuine, broke tension during a weary haul. Mary, still cloaked in the role of Mark, found her place within this weave. She spoke little, but her silence no longer felt like distance. It had become part of the crew's fabric, trusted as much as the gunner's aim or the carpenter's eye. One afternoon, a squall caught the William off Cuba's coast. Dark clouds rose sudden, spilling rain in sheets, slapping sails with the flat of their hands. Orders rang, men scrambled, lines groaned, yet no one shouted in fear. Each knew his place, his duty. Anne lashed the boom with a steadiness that belied the water streaming down her face. Mary braced at the bow, hands sure on the forward gun, every motion efficient. When the storm passed, as swiftly as it had come, the crew laughed in relief, wrung water from their sleeves, and set to drying powder. No one praised, no one chided. They simply returned to order. And yet, in the glances exchanged, in the pats on shoulders, in the quiet nods, trust deepened. Bonds forged in squall and silence alike hold stronger than those made only in victory. Anne felt it most keenly when she caught sight of Mary later that night, sitting alone with a knife across her knees, sharpening in slow strokes. Lantern light caught her eyes, and for a heartbeat, Anne thought she saw not Mark, but the woman beneath, the truth flickering in shadow. It was gone as quickly as it came, but the recognition, staid trust is not only built at sea. In Nassau, when the William returned with its modest prizes, bonds were tested anew. Some men drank too deeply and let tongues wag. Others grew restless, tempted by easier coin ashore. Yet in those moments, Anne and Mary seemed to anchor the crew, each in her own way. Anne did it with fire. She carried herself into the tavern with the ease of someone who belonged, who would not be diminished. She drank, she laughed, she played cards, and when a man grew too bold, she met his eyes with a glare sharp enough to still him. Men followed her, not out of affection alone, but because she embodied the spirit of defiance they longed to hold on to. Mary did it with quiet. She slipped through taverns like a shadow, speaking when needed, watching always. When dice rolled hot and tempers flared, her presence calmed without command. Her skill at cards was neither boastful nor shy, just steady, enough to win respect. She was the stone at the bottom of the bucket, unseen, but keeping all from toppling. It was in these nights that Anne began to sense the peculiar bond forming between them. It was not friendship in the ordinary sense, for too much lay unspoken. It was not rivalry, for each respected the other's ground. It was something older, deeper, a recognition of shared weight. Anne's fury, Mary's silence, different masks, same burden. One evening, when the William was nearly ready to sail again, Anne found Mary near the docks, gazing out toward the sea. The air smelled of tar and tide, lanterns swinging in the breeze. "You keep to yourself too much," Anne said softly, approaching. Mary did not turn. Easier that way. Easier, maybe, but not always better. A long pause, the tide lapping at pilings, then Mary's voice, low but firm. Better to keep one truth than to trade it for suspicion. Anne studied her. One day, you'll trust someone with more than silence. Mary finally turned, eyes unreadable. And one day, you'll trust someone with less than fire. The words hung between them, not accusation, not comfort, but recognition. Two ways of carrying the same weight. Two roads meeting in the same harbor. The crew, for all their rough edges, sensed the bond too. They spoke less of Anne as merely Rackham's woman, and more of her as comrade. They no longer treated Mark as an odd, quiet hand, but as a pillar, someone whose silence steadied rather than unsettled. In time, such shifts become habits. Trust was tested again on the water, during a skirmish with a small Spanish merchantman. It was hardly a battle. 2 broadsides, a brief clash of steel, then surrender. Yet in those minutes, clarity revealed itself. Anne fought with her customary blaze, cutlass flashing, her voice sharp as she urged men forward. Mary moved with precision, covering flanks, striking only when needed, her knife finding its mark like a surgeon's tool. Later, dividing the modest spoils, Rackham allowed the crew, their cheers, but Anne and Mary sat apart for a time, sharing only silence. It was enough. That night, under a wide Caribbean sky, Anne leaned against the rail, hair loose in the breeze. Mary stood beside her, shoulders straight, gaze fixed on constellations she pretended to name as a man would. For a moment, Anne let the silence grow. Then she said, barely above the wash of waves, "You don't fool me, you know." Mary's jaw tightened. "And yet you say nothing. Because sometimes silence is trust." Mary looked at her then, truly looked, and though her mouth said nothing, her eyes softened. In that glance lay the seed of something rare, a trust so quiet it did not need to be spoken, a bond deeper than disguise, deeper than fear. And as the William sailed on into night, the two women, one in fire, one in silence, stood together, unmasked only to each other, for just long enough to believe such trust could hold. Quiet news draws the circle close. Morning in Nassau arrived the way a letter slides under a door, softly, but with something to say. The light came pale and even, laying a sheet of pewter over the harbor, making masts look like pencil lines against a sky not yet certain of its color. Carts rattled with half-hearted cheer, the vendors called, and somewhere a window shutter tapped like a lazy metronome. In the tavern, Anne swept the floor with slow, even strokes, raising a hush of dust that turned gold where it crossed a stray bar of sunlight. Outside, a courier pinned a fresh notice to the weathered board beside the custom house. The wax was new, red as a cut pomegranate, and the ribbon blue and brisk. The paper itself had that look official proclamations always wore, too fine for the climate, edges already buckling in the damp, but the letters bold enough to stare down the ocean. A boy read the top line aloud and whispered the numbers as if numbers themselves could bite. Bounties, names, routes. Jack Rackham, he sounded out, stumbling a little. Then others, men still at large, ships still swift, coasts now watched. The sound reached the tavern before the words did. It was a change in pitch, like a song dipping a note. Anne stepped to the doorway, her broom still in hand, and let her eyes travel across the square. She saw shoulders draw in, mouths thin out, and men who had been walking decide quietly not to go where they'd been going. The notice made everyone turn, and in turning, the town discovered how closely it had been walking to the edge of a map sketched by other hands. By noon, a copy had traveled as far as the jetty. Sailors read it with faces that did not move much. A scarred topman held it at arm's length, then closer, then squinted at the small lines that set out the patrols. Sloops running the Carolinas like a comb through wet hair. A frigate anchored in Jamaica. Cutters nosing the Bahamas like patient dogs. There were dates, recent, and there were places, too many. It did not roar like a threat. It leaned. Anne felt the lean. She poured ale for men who thanked her with absent nods, their minds already measuring wind and law. She watched a pair of pardoned sailors tuck their hands under their thighs, as if sitting on them might stop a tide. She noticed, too, those others at the notice board, neither sailors nor clerks, who read with careful attention, but asked no one for clarity. Informants, perhaps only men who liked to keep their worries polished. The Crown needed no cannon to push a town. It needed paper and a pen and someone to read aloud. When Mary came ashore that afternoon, marked to any eye but Anne's, she stood longer than most at the board. Her face did not admit surprise. It rarely did. But there was a softening at the corners of the mouth, a minute loosening that Anne recognized as thought-making room for consequence. Mary's gaze slid over the routes, the bounties, the tidy names that made wide seas narrow. She did not touch the page. She did not have to. Words can reach without being reached for. Back at the tavern, the air thickened with talk that would not call itself fear. Men told old stories with new care. Songs lost a verse. Dice landed with a quieter clatter. Anne wiped the bar and listened. Between one mug and the next, a phrase drifted across like a faint smell of rain. "They are netting the water." It was said without drama, without bitterness, almost admiring, but nets do not care what is admirable. They care only for openings and the lack of them. The William left at first light 2 days later, sliding from the anchorage with the hush of a practiced departure. No extra clank, no show of sail, only the neat business of men doing what they had written they would do. The sea wore its good linen, a brushed blue with a mild heave, and the wind came honest off the beam. Far off, a rain squall combed the horizon and moved on, losing interest. On the makeshift chart table, the quartermasters spread their world. It looked smaller these days. He set a finger on the ragged necklace of Ks and crooked channels, and then traced 3 slow lines. The obvious lane, the bold lane, and the one a cautious man takes when the night has time in it. "Cutters off Abaco," he said in a voice meant for one pair of ears and the sea. "A sloop working the line to Charlestown. Frigate sits in Kingston like a church bell. Best we make our asks where you can still hear your own answer." Rackham nodded, not theatrical, not glum. He had learned, as the gaudier sort sometimes do, that color hides best beneath a sensible coat. "Ease south of the usual," he said. "Let them comb the middle while we pick the hem." No swagger in it, only the seamstress's wisdom, a garment phrase where it is touched most. Mary stood near the forward shrouds, eyes on the shape the water made where wind disagreed with current. She felt the new geometry of their world in the soles of her feet. Once, risk had come like weather, visible, arguable, moving. Now it came like arithmetic, columns and sums. Patrol here plus cutter there equals a shadow that will fall where you would most like it not to. She adjusted the set of a line without looking down and let the ship thank her. Through the way, it ran a hair easier. By afternoon, they met a coaster tacking politely along a crease of wind. Her deck crowded not with smug faces but with barrels, coils, and a crew that looked thin with honest work. The customary hail was exchanged, where bound, where from, and then, because human beings cannot help themselves, a little news changed hands like salt. The coaster's master, his hat brim eaten thin by sun, told of a Virginian lieutenant who'd taken a liking to muddy inlets and pretense, of papers shown at odd hours, of lanterns hidden and then made to glow at the right moment. "They learn our ways, same as we learned theirs," he said, not aggrieved, only observing. "Men who fish learn to think like fish. Men who hunt fishermen learn to do the same. They traded water for words and words for water. The William sent over a small keg of sweeter stuff, and the coaster's boy, barefoot, bright, a grin missing for reasons long past mending, brought back a satchel with a handful of old nails and a biscuit tin full of rumors. One story insisted Blackbeard had gone quiet in the sounds up north, fettling a sloop with more patience than sense. Another had Charles Vane slipping the noose of a blockade like an eel through fingers. A third swore a governor somewhere had finally learned to say pardon without thinking trap. But no one offered a map to that rarity. The sun grew polite and stepped a pace down the sky. The coaster held her line and dwindled. The William bore a point more to the east, a small decision in a large room. On deck, the talk turned to immediate things: powder to be kept bone dry, bread to be inspected for the too lively, the swivel gun's sleeve to be resewn where the salt had cracked it white. Anne moved among jobs without calling attention to her crossings. She felt the crew's mood in her hands the way a spinner feels wool. Tighter than yesterday, but not knotted. When night came, it brought the kind of dark that forgives and records in equal measure. Stars laid out their careful work. The wake wrote with sparks. In the low light near the mainmast, the quartermaster drew a small circle with his forefinger atop the chart. No ink, only intent. "Here," he said to Rackham, "where the Navy is sure no one will bother to go, because it is an inconvenience." Inconvenience is our friend. Rackham smiled with half his mouth. "I've had worse friends," he said. Mary, on the foredeck, measured the sky by breadth rather than angle. The constellations shifted so slowly a man could live a life and never catch them moving. The net the governors threw, though wide, could not hold the sky. She let that ease her enough to sit. The deck was warm from the day. The ship, content to be steered by those who had signed their names to one another, made the sound a cradle makes when a mother rocks it with her foot while her hands do other work. The net shows itself first as absence, a lane that used to be easy, now thick with speculation. A cove that used to feel like home, now carrying the memory of boots on sand. Even kindness learns which doors to knock more softly. When the William nudged into a tucked-away anchorage 3 evenings later, the shore smelled familiar. Mangrove, damp rope, the sweet rot of leaves. But the feeling was not the same. In place of the usual unrolling of relief came a caution that did not announce itself, only sat down and stayed. They set a riding light no higher than a man's shoulder and tended it like a secret. Supper came, blessedly dull. Beans that tasted better than they looked. Pork that looked better than it tasted. Bread whose weevils were sternly invited to leave. Men ate with that companionable quiet, which is not silence, but truce. Someone sang a verse and forgot the second. No one minded. Toward the end of the watch, a small boat ghosted along the mangroves, a smear of darker dark, a faint shuffle of oars feathered careful. Anne saw it first. She was already looking the way a person does who expects the world to bring something. She touched Mark's sleeve. Mary's head turned, no startle in it. The quartermaster drifted up from the shadow by the main, all unhurried, as if to stretch his legs. "Boat there," came the soft call from the bow. "Easy," the quartermaster returned. "If it were malice, it would be brighter." The skiff eased alongside like a cat that has learned a door and wants it to open without a word. In her sat 2 fishermen with faces that had learned night better than day. One raised a hand without lifting it high. "Begging pardon," he said, voice low. "We saw your light and thought you might want the look of a paper we were told not to show." He passed up a folded sheet, oilskin wrapped. The twin, in a manner of speaking, of the Williams' own articles, though this one smelled of offices and floors swept with stiff brooms. The quartermaster took it as a man takes a child from a tired mother, careful, ready to hand it back. He opened it under the small lamp, sparing as much light as a line of type needs. The crest glowered, the lines marched. It was a notice from a governor, not theirs, the ink still dark, the date still near. It did not say pirates or demons or monsters. It said, instead, that certain captains had names, and those names had prices, that ships of a particular rig would be watched, that inlets known to be frequented by certain persons would be kept a little tighter by men who did not mind mud. It asked for cooperation with the politeness of a knife put gently on a table. "Why bring it?" Rackham asked, the question mild, his eyes not. The older fisherman's mouth tugged sideways, not quite a smile. "Because men who think the law is the only net have never needed to eat what they catch," he said. "A sea too tidy leaves no fish." He tapped the paper. "They clean as if the ocean were a parlor. We like our parlor to keep a little ocean in it. And because," said the younger, One of those names. He swallowed. My uncle ran line with him once, before the Crown decided his hands were too quick. He's not a villain. He's only good at the wrong thing. That earned a small sound from Anne, something between a breath and a laugh without the sharp recognition, perhaps, of the way virtue and skill are measured by the man doing the measuring. Mary's eyes rested on the paper and then lifted to the ring of night beyond the lamp. She had never expected justice to be tidy, but she had hoped now and then it would be a shade more honest than this. They gave the fisherman bread and a coil of serviceable line, and did not call it payment. The skiff faded back among the mangroves like a thought a man chooses to keep to himself a while longer. When the cove grew quiet again, the crew gathered in the kind of circle people make when they do not wish to announce that they are assembling. The quartermaster laid the notice beside their own oilskin case. 2 papers, one that promised a fair deck, the other that promised a tight sea. Rackham put a fingertip on the governor's fold, and then on their articles. "We are not the thing they've written down," he said, mild as the lamplight, "but we live where their ink reaches." "And where it doesn't," Anne murmured, eyes on the places between the mangrove shadows. Mary, who had kept her voice all day as flat as a chart's margin, let it bend a little. "Nets don't just catch," she said. "They teach fish new water." A long quiet followed, the kind that is neither lull nor dread, but the taking of measure. Men shifted their weight and found the deck under them as steady as it had been before the paper came aboard. A lantern crackled and settled. Somewhere, a crab fussed at a piling and gave up. They did not plan a heroic dash that night. They planned an earlier watch, a different landfall, a way of making their small shadow stand where larger shadows fell. It is not less brave to live by wits than by noise. Sometimes it is the only bravery that lasts the week. Before racketing off to their posts, the quartermaster slid both papers home, their promise and the Crown's, to the same niche below. Side by side, they made a kind of lesson. One tells you who you hope to be. The other tells you where you will be seen. Wisdom is the knack of sailing between the two without losing yourself to either. The tide turned with a sigh more felt than heard. Lines murmured. A man on the middle watch cleared his throat, softly, as if not to trouble the birds. Anne and Mary shared a glance that said both fire and silence could keep, for now, in their proper sheaths. Above them, the sky spared a bright path between 2 clouds. The ship, pleased to have been steered by hands that read both papers with equal care, settled into the breathing of the night. Old names linger like sails on the horizon. The sea has its own memory. It does not write in ink or scratch on stone, but it remembers in currents, in shifting sandbars, in wrecks that lie quiet beneath swaying weed. Men, too, carry memory across water, though theirs is less steady. A tale told in one port arrives in another, bent by wind and wine, yet something of its truth endures. On the William, such tales traveled most easily at night. After the watches were set and the deck swayed with its slow, even rhythm, voices would drift like smoke above the lanterns. One man recalled serving a fortnight under a captain who swore the moon controlled luck more than tide. Another spoke of a sloop found adrift with her galley fire still warm and no crew at all. These were the usual tales, meant to shiver and amuse. But sometimes the names came, the names that carried weight even among men who had long since left their shadows. Blackbeard, Vane, Bonnet, Roberts. Each name was like a spark struck from flint, lighting eyes and loosening tongues. Some told of the battle at Ocracoke, how Teach had fought on when riddled with bullets, swearing as if each wound made him larger. Others swore Vane had escaped 3 times from noose and guard alike, slippery as an eel. Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, was said to have read more books than charts, a folly that had carried him straight to the gallows. Roberts, still at large, was whispered about with a respect that shaded into envy. Anne listened with the half-smile of someone who had seen enough to know the line between truth and embroidery, but who also understood that embroidery has its own strength. Mary, Mark to the crew, listened too, her face steady, her silence making men fill it with more words. Between them, the 2 women knew that legends, even flawed, could be shields as well as burdens. One evening, a young hand asked too boldly, "And what of Anne Bonny?" "They say she fights alongside Rackham. Some swear she's a fury, others that she's just as fancy dressed up." Laughter scattered, uncertain, until Anne herself leaned forward from the shadows. "What do you believe?" she asked. The boy swallowed. "I think," he said slowly, "if it were true, no one would laugh." Anne's eyes softened. "Then keep that thought." The laughter died away, replaced by the creak of wood and the hush of the sea. Legends walked lighter after that. Legends were not confined to words. Sometimes they appeared in sails against the horizon, familiar rigs that stirred unease long before identification was certain. Off Hispaniola, the William once spotted such a silhouette, a brigantine low and dark, cutting the wind with the sure stride of a predator. For a moment, hearts leapt. Could it be Roberts himself, or another, captain of fierce renown? The crew whispered, each man hoping for treasure, yet fearing the weight of a true legend. The brigantine passed at distance, her course indifferent. Still, for hours afterward, men spoke of what might have been. Some said they had glimpsed a black flag at her gaff, though others swore it was only a shadow. Anne said nothing, only watched until the ship dwindled into haze. Mary stood beside her, hands folded on the rail, gaze fixed and thoughtful. "Do you think they see us as we see them?" Anne asked at last, her tone half musing. Mary shook her head. "Legends don't look sideways. They look forward." The words settled like ballast. Anne wondered if she herself had already stepped into story, whether she wanted to or not. It is one thing to chase a name, another to wake one morning and find yourself wearing it. In port, too, legends followed. Tavern keepers repeated them for coin, printers in Kingston set them in ink, and governors pinned them to boards as warnings. Each telling bent the truth further, yet the more bent, the more lasting. A clean truth may vanish, a crooked one grips memory like a burr. Mary, wary of recognition, lived within these tales like a man walking through fog. At times she wondered whether her disguise was less about hiding than about controlling which legend would be believed. Better to be Mark, a skilled hand, than Mary, a woman out of place. Anne, bolder, let whispers flare and die. If men thought her Rackham's fury, so be it. Fury was better armor than frailty. By lantern light, Fletcher once leaned close and muttered, "Mark my words, one day they'll print pamphlets about us too. They'll paint you taller, Anne, and you quieter, Mark. They'll call Jack braver than he is, and none of it will matter, because people will rather believe the tale than the truth." Mary met his gaze coolly. "Then we'd best give them something worth believing." Anne laughed softly at that, a laugh with edges, or something they'll never forget. The test of legend came sharper weeks later. The William captured a small Spanish trader near the Windward Passage, her hold filled with sugar and hides. It was an easy prize, taken with barely a shot. Yet as the prisoners were brought aboard, one of them, a wiry man with eyes too sharp for a merchant, stared at Anne and Mary with recognition. "I've heard of you," he spat, voice rough with defiance. "The women. They say you dress as men, fight as demons. An abomination." His words were meant as insult, but they struck like acknowledgement. The crew shifted, glances darting toward their two disguised anomalies. For a breath, the deck felt thin, stretched between truth and legend. Anne stepped forward, her cutlass at her hip, her gaze steady. "They say many things," she replied calmly. "Some of them true, most of them not. What matters is this: you surrendered, and because of that, you live." She turned away, ending the matter. The crew exhaled. The prisoner was sent below, grumbling but alive. Later, in the quiet of night, Mary sat alone, replaying the words. Legends were no longer only stories told by others. They were beginning to be spoken in the faces of enemies, whispered in the fear of men who had never seen them fight. The mask she wore protected her body, yes, but it no longer protected her from memory. She was already written into the sea's account. Anne joined her, setting down 2 mugs. "He called us demons." Mary's mouth twisted. "Better that than dolls." They drank in silence. Above them, the stars burned with the same indifferent light that had once guided Teach, Vane, Bonnet, Roberts, all names now folded into tale. Anne and Mary sat between silence and legend, knowing the tide carried them nearer with each passing day. The William rocked gently, her timbers sighing. Below deck, the prisoners muttered. Above, the watch paced. But on that patch of planking, 2 women felt the weight of stories, old ones that pressed behind, new ones that loomed ahead. And somewhere deep within, both knew, once a name becomes legend, it can never again belong wholly to the person who lived it. Tempests outside mirror tempests inside. The Caribbean is a patient teacher, though its lessons are rarely gentle. One morning, the William sailed beneath a sky that looked fair enough, pale blue and untroubled, with only a scatter of high clouds drifting eastward like idle thoughts. The sea lay calm, its surface shining as if burnished, each wave no more than a ripple of silk. Yet old sailors glanced upward, sniffed the air, and shifted uneasily on their feet, for those who had lived long enough among these waters knew that such calmness could be the stillness before the fist. By midday, the horizon had thickened. A smudge of gray gathered, then another, until the east was a sheet of slate. The wind freshened, playful at first, then insistent, tugging at sleeves and rattling loose lashings. Men hurried to shorten sail, bare feet thudding across the deck. Rackham stood by the wheel, his gaudy coat traded for a tarred canvas jacket, his voice sharper than usual, but steady. Anne helped reef the mainsail, her hair bound tight against the gusts. Mary moved swiftly along the bow, checking lashings with practiced calm, her face unreadable, but her motions sure. The first squall struck like a slap. Rain lashed the deck in white sheets, stinging skin, soaking through canvas in moments. Thunder rolled above, not once but again and again, a heavy drum that shook the timbers. The William heeled hard, water surging over her lee rail, before righting herself with a groan. Men clung to lines, teeth clenched, eyes wide. For an hour, the world narrowed to wind, water, and will. Then, as swiftly as it had begun, the storm moved on, leaving the sea unsettled but the sky clearing. The crew sagged with relief, laughing raggedly, slapping backs, wringing water from their sleeves. The storm had tested them and found them standing. Yet the true storm was not only in the sky. it lingered in the hearts of those aboard, a reminder that danger lay not only in cannon or gallows, but in the whims of nature itself. Anne felt it most keenly. She stood at the rail, rain dripping from her lashes, and thought of how small even the fiercest fighter seemed against the sea's indifference. Mary joined her, silent, shoulder brushing shoulder. No words passed, but the bond between them deepened. In storms, masks falter, and truth shows itself in the steadiness of hands, the refusal to yield. When night fell, the storm's memory lingered. The ship creaked with the swell, her timbers damp and fragrant with wet oak. Below deck, the crew sprawled in weary heaps, too tired even for song. Dice lay forgotten, mugs half empty. Men spoke in low tones, voices still carrying the storm's hush. It was in such quiet that storms within began to stir. Fletcher, restless, muttered about the futility of their course, about how the Navy's net tightened daily. His words slithered through the gloom like a wet rope. A few men grunted in agreement, but most said nothing. Silence, in its own way, can weigh more than words. Rackham, hearing of it, chose not to thunder. Instead, he gathered the crew by lantern light on the main deck, the sea a black heave around them. His voice was measured, not loud, but deliberate. He spoke of storms weathered, of prizes taken, of the articles signed with each man's hand. He reminded them that the sea was never kind, but neither was the shore, where pardons were fickle and honest work scarce for men with salt in their blood. Anne watched him closely, noting the strain beneath his composure. Rackham was not Blackbeard, nor Roberts. He lacked their grand command. Yet he had something else, a willingness to bend without breaking, to admit doubt while still holding the tiller. That, she thought, might be a rarer strength. Later, in the captain's small cabin, Anne confronted him. "They sense your hesitation," she said quietly. Rackham sighed, his shoulders heavy. "And you do not?" Anne met his gaze evenly. "I do. But I also see you standing, even when the storm would throw you. That counts for something." Mary entered then, drawn by the undercurrent of unease. She did not speak at first, only listened, eyes sharp in the dim lamplight. When she finally spoke, her words were few but heavy. "Storms are not beaten. They are endured. We endured today. We can endure again." The three of them sat in silence for a long while, the lantern's flame swaying with the swell. Outside, the sea heaved like a sleeping giant, and within, the ship held its fragile balance. Days passed, calmer but charged with a subtle tension. Storms leave traces invisible to the eye. A hairline crack in a spar, a frayed edge in a rope, a shadow in the mind. Men worked, sang, even joked, but now and then their gazes strayed eastward, wary of clouds. Anne carried her own storm quietly. She remembered the prisoner's words weeks earlier. Demons, he had called them, and she wondered how long before the world's whispers shaped her into something unrecognizable, even to herself. Mary sensed it. One evening, she found Anne brooding at the stern and said softly, "The sea calls us what it will. Better we decide what we answer to." Anne gave her a sidelong glance. "And what do you answer to?" Mary was silent for a long time. Then, simply, "Survivor." The word hung between them, both a shield and a burden. Meanwhile, Fletcher's discontent grew sharper, though he voiced it in whispers. He spoke of pardons, of safety ashore, of the folly of chasing prizes when the net drew tighter. Yet for every ear he bent, another ear bent back toward Anne or Mary, seeking steadiness. Trust, once earned in storm, proved harder to shake than complaint. Another squall came, smaller, but fierce enough to test them again. This time, the crew met it with quicker hands, steadier hearts. The William danced on waves that might once have swamped her. When the sky cleared, men grinned through salt spray, shouting into the wind. The storm within had met the storm without, and for now, they both had passed. That night, Anne lay awake in her hammock, listening to the creak of beams. She thought of storms yet to come, not only of wind and sea, but of law and legend. She thought of Mary's quiet resolve, Rackham's faltering courage, her own fire. She wondered which would hold when the next tempest broke. For now, the William sailed steady, her wake glowing faintly with phosphorescence, as if the sea itself remembered their endurance and left a trail of stars to honor it. Shallow water favors quiet minds. Evening came on like a careful hand drawing a curtain, the light thinning to a pewter wash that made the shoals seem gentle and the horizon nearer than it truly was. The William moved under shortened canvas, not sneaking so much as keeping her voice down. Over the door and barrel chart table, the quartermaster had set 3 pebbles, one for each choice. The first pebble marked the open lane, well sounded, well watched. The second lay on the crooked chain of quays where wind and tide bickered, and men with badges got bored. The third sat by a skinny blue channel, drawn like a thread through teeth. Rackham touched the third pebble, and did not make a speech. "We'll sew where they cannot see the stitch," he said, and looked to Mary. She took the helm without ceremony, palms feeling the worn spokes as if greeting an old friend who kept secrets. Anne went forward to the lead line with a topman, knot marks biting cool into her fingers. The line's plumb bob, polished by years of sea, swung like a small heart. She fed it out and called in a voice low enough not to jar the dusk. By the mark, 5 and a half 5, and 5 again. The numbers were simple, almost homely, but they decided futures. Around them the water turned the color of pewter hammered thin. Mangroves made a dark frill along the flats. Somewhere, a heron picked its way through tide lines and thought nothing at all of bounties or orders. The air smelled of salt, mud, and the faint pepper of crushed shell. Boat to the south, came the bowman's hush, and the speaking stopped for a stretch. Along the open water, a low hull moved with intent, but not with hurry. A cutter by the look of her, 2 lanterns set sensible and legal. She angled across the broader entrance to the bight as if stitching it closed. "Hold your voice steady," the quartermaster said, not to any one man, but to the ship. Mary set her jaw and leaned a fraction on the lee spokes. The William did not flinch. Anne let the line drop and rise and drop again, finding the bottom as if it were reading her mind. "And a quarter less 5, she murmured, and they shaved another yard off fear. The cutter slid by at distance, never quite showing her full face, never quite turning away. A man on her quarter lifted a glass and did not bother to hide it. Mary answered by doing nothing flamboyant at all. A small correction here, a breath of sheet there. The quiet dignity of a vessel that looks like she belongs. Deception, properly practiced, is not a flourish. It is the absence of unnecessary gesture. When at last, the cutter took an interest in some other shadow near the outer bar, a low murmur passed the William's deck. Not relief exactly, but something made of the same cloth. The crew went on with their plain work. Anne wiped salt from her knuckles on a bit of rag and took another cast of the line. "By the mark, 4, she said, and smiled because the number was both warning and welcome. Shoal water is honest. It tells you where you stand. They found the quay by smell before sight, the sweet rot of mangrove giving way to sun-warmed limestone, and a whiff of something green that had fought hard through salt air to make itself a leaf. The place had no name the charts cared to print, but men who needed names had given it one that carried more affection than accuracy: Needle's Eye. Holes in the rock let the tide breathe in and out like a sleeping thing. If you knew when to thread them, the cove inside held still water as polished as a pew. They careened on the first of the moontide. It is a half-domestic, half-absurd labor, careening, a ship drawn down on her side like a giant child being coaxed into a bath. Men set tackles in the mangroves, bited lines around the mast, and hauled in time, voices low but easy. The William settled onto her shoulder with a long, satisfied creak. Her copper and wood belly, usually shy, turned modestly to the sun. Barnacles showed their small, stubborn citadels. Weed clung in beards. Scrapers went to work with a sound like rain on a tin roof. Pitch pots bubbled, smelling of pine and patience. Men smeared black, thick comfort into seams, then smoothed it with the flat of a hand and the heel of a rag. Anne moved along the hull like a woman beating dust from a rug, quick and thorough, hair tied back, sleeves rolled. Mary knelt by the forefoot with a lad and taught him how to set oakum just proud, so the seam would swell kind when the tide came home. The boy's tongue peeped out with concentration. Mary's mouth held a line that would have been a smile if it had allowed itself that liberty. On shore, a little market appeared from the scrub as if the island had been keeping it in a pocket for just such a day. A woman with limes and cassava, a fisherman with a string of snapper, a man who claimed, without overmuch conviction, to be a carpenter. The quartermaster met them with a scale that had been true since Jamaica, and a ledger that told a fair story. The articles had a way of walking off the page and into the palm. They paid not with swagger, but with coin and gratitude. The woman with limes looked hard at Rackham, and harder still at the men who were not Rackham. "You leave no fire," she said, the island law of common sense. "No fire," Rackham promised, and looked to Anne. She nodded. A bucket of sea lay close to every pot. The cook swore mildly in 3 languages at a fire that refused to misbehave. Toward afternoon, a skiff nosed in among the mangrove roots. An old man with the tough, salt-soft skin the tropics grant their faithful lifted a hand without lifting his voice. He carried no weapon larger than a boat hook and the authority of 30 hurricane seasons. "News floats farther than Cork," he said, not unkindly. A sloop with a captain who wears too many pistols at his breast sat outside the long inlet 2 nights and let no one pass without questions that sounded like sermons. "Virginia?" Mary asked, as if the compass were a man. "Close enough to smell tobacco," the old man said. "Closer to iron." He shifted his weight and let the skiff settle. "You keep your tide." The outer bar shoals a little to the east since the last blow. A good man sings to his lead line when he goes there. Anne offered him water and a heel of bread not yet stale. He took the bread as a courtesy rather than a need, and drank as if to be companionable. "Women," he said at last, eyes taking in and then not minding. "The sea keeps her own counsel." Then he pushed off and slid away down a water path only people born to mangrove can read. By dusk, the hull shone with a workman's pride. The ship took herself upright with a relieved thump. Men coiled lines with that small extra neatness that follows a day spent mending. The pitch cooled. The limes turned to quarter wedges in a tub of water. The cook made a prodigal show of sprinkling them over beans and fish, and men grinned as if a king had sent dessert. On the sand, Anne and Mary sat where the foam must choose whether to wet their boots. They did not talk about the old man's warning or about the inlet watched by sermons. They talked for once about nothing useful. A childhood memory of a hedge that threw white flowers across a lane. The first time a rope burned a palm, and the sting surprised more than the pain. How boats smell different when they belong to rivers. The tide came a handspan nearer, and they lifted their feet to let it pass without comment. "Tomorrow we thread it," Anne said finally, almost to the water. Mary nodded. "Then we keep to the blue that is not on charts." Night rose without fuss. A wind ran its fingers along the mangrove fringe and found no mischief worth making. Somewhere beyond the reef a fish leapt and came down with the quiet of a man changing his mind. They left in the hour before day when birds have the sky to themselves. The sea outside the eye made a soft hum under the keel, satisfied with the clean skin it now stroked. Lanterns were hooded, voices already tuned to narrow water. The lead line swung and sang, Anne's calls braided with the ship's breath. By the mark 4.5 4, and steady by the deep 5. The outer bar showed where the old man had promised it would not, farther east, sly as a cat. The channel, which last year had made sense like a sentence you knew, now threw in a new comma. Mary steered the punctuation. The William's bow drew the gentlest curve, a gesture of apology to the sand. The ship brushed nothing but her own shadow. Beyond the bar, the color changed the way voices change when a door closes. Deep water went bluer than ink. Far to the south, a smudge marked a cutter or a coaster. It did not matter which yet. To the north, a line of low squall ran like a blackboard slate with one word written on it: hurry. Rackham made no fuss with orders. He had learned to let the ship do the part she could. "Stays'l," he said, almost as if asking a favor. Canvas crept up and took a good grip of the wind. The William's shoulders lifted. An hour later, the smudge to the south became a shape, and then an attitude, not a coaster. The cutter's masts drew themselves with the confidence of men who expect answers. No flag flew yet, but flags, like questions, can be taken from pockets as needed. "Trader's clothes," the quartermaster murmured, and 3 men made a drab of the William in short order. A spare jib ragged at the leech, coil piles made conspicuously slack, a tarp thrown over the bowgun as carelessly as a sleepy cat. Anne walked the deck in the slow, pinched footway of a person who expects to haggle over salt. Mary eased the helm into a little-to-weather slouch. Everything about the ship said, "We are weary of arguing and eager to reach a cheap anchorage." The cutter came on, her bow wave showing she did not entirely believe the world's good intentions. At a distance that made a shout risky and a shot foolish, she bore away a fraction and showed a white cloth, the maritime equivalent of a raised hand. Rackham raised his own and tilted his palm to show it held nothing but daylight. What saved them, if saved is the right word, was not performance, but geography. A pale band to starboard marked the broken teeth of a second, less civilized reef, the kind charts suggest with a shrug. Between the William and those teeth ran a narrow scar of darker water, a back eddy the color of pewter. The cutter, with her deeper pride and her heavier purse, would need to stand off, then loop and reach. Patience is a commodity, and men with orders spend it faster than men with needs. "Now," Mary said so lightly it could have been the wind. Anne let the hooded lantern glow a shade brighter, as if a galley cook had lifted a lid to check a stew. Domestic, unthreatening. The cutter answered with nothing more than suspicion made visible in the tilt of her sails. She stood off to take a wider bite of the sea. In that small space, the William slipped through the darker scar. The reef lifted its white eyelids and then forgot them. They were not unseen. One cannot vanish from a man whose job it is not to let you, but they were no longer the easiest problem on his desk. As they slid past the last pale roar of water on stone, the cutter grew busy with her own arithmetic. Someone aboard her made a small, wise decision to delay the argument until more convenient. The Williams wake, more silver than foam, laid itself down like a signature only fish will read. The day opened itself fully, and the light came honest and ungilded. Men let out breaths they had been saving for some later date. The quartermaster folded his drab smile and put it away. Rackham let his shoulders drop a finger's width. Anne eased the tarp from the bowgun and stowed it with the dignity such tools deserve. Mary looked at the place where the sea had allowed them, and then at the wider blue ahead. "They cannot fence all of it," Anne said, not asking for agreement. "No," Mary answered, hands resting loose on the spokes. "Only enough to make us careful. Careful and something else. Attentive, perhaps, to the way small, honest things still ran the world. The truth a lead line tells. The courtesy paid to a mangrove root with a line around it. The plain kindness of paying fare for limes. A lantern glow made to look like soup. Behind them, the needle's eye pinched to a pinprick and then went away. Ahead, the sea spread its patient ledger. They would sign again on its lines before long, with choices and with wake. For the hour given them, the wind hummed like a low blessing through rigging freshly set, and the ship, clean of weed and blacked against leaks, felt lighter than law. Quiet waters hide watchful eyes. The William moved steadily westward, her sails trimmed close to the breeze, her crew alert though not anxious. It was the kind of weather a sailor prays for. Wind strong enough to fill canvas but not enough to strain it. Waves rolling deep and even. Sky brushed with white that promised no mischief. Yet beneath that calm, there was a weight, an unspoken knowledge that each passing day the sea was being measured, patrolled, divided into smaller pieces by men who had no love for those who defied their order. By now, news had spread with the relentlessness of tide. Posters nailed to custom house walls, proclamations read aloud in marketplaces, whispers passed over mugs of watered rum. Everywhere came the same message: pardons dwindling, gallows waiting, the golden days of free seas waning. A week ago, in a narrow anchorage, the crew had taken aboard a fisherman's warning. Cutters kept close to Florida, frigates anchored along Jamaica, even Tortuga less welcoming. Nowhere could be trusted for long. On deck, Anne leaned against the rail, eyes half shut against the sun's glare on the water. Her hair, damp from spray, clung to her cheekbones. She looked weary, but not in body. It was the weariness of one who knows her time may be shorter than she wishes, who senses the narrowing path ahead. Mary joined her quietly, leaning a shoulder to the rail so their silhouettes almost touched. "They watch from every harbor now," Anne murmured. Mary nodded once. "Nets catch fish, but not all, not all," Anne echoed. Her voice held a kind of dry defiance, but beneath it lay something harder to name. Nearby, Rackham paced the quarterdeck. His gaudy coat was tucked away. On days like this, he favored plain work clothes, but his restlessness showed in the way he tapped his fingers along the rail, his gaze flicking from horizon to sail to chart, as if expecting the sea to show him its hand. He was not a coward. He was not reckless either. He was a man aware that his choices grew narrower, and that every mile they sailed was another square of net being drawn in. The crew, for their part, carried on with the ordinary business of seafaring. Ropes coiled, sails checked, powder kept dry. biscuit inspected, yet their voices, when they spoke, were low, measured. Jests were fewer. Dice lay untouched some nights. When men sing less, it is not because they have forgotten the words. It is because they are saving breath for what may be coming. 2 days later, the William slipped into a quiet cove along the northern coast of Hispaniola. The anchorage was a patch of deep blue tucked behind a spit of limestone and mangrove. On shore, a small hut leaned under the weight of sun, its roof patched with palm thatch. An old woman sat outside, weaving a net, her hands moving slow but steady. Rackham went ashore with Anne and Mary, leaving the quartermaster to mind the deck. The air smelled of wood smoke and salt, of the faint sweetness of drying plantain. The woman looked up as they approached, eyes clouded with age but sharp beneath. "You bring trouble on the tide," she said simply, though her voice was not unkind. "We bring coin," Rackham offered, showing a small pouch. "And we need water, fruit, and perhaps a word of news." She set the net aside and studied them in silence for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Water you may take. Fruit I can give. News is heavier." Anne crouched near the fire, warming her hands, though the day was hot. "Tell it anyway," she urged softly. The old woman's gaze lingered on her. "You are the one they whisper of, a woman with steel in her hand, standing among men. And another," she glanced at Mary, "who hides her truth like a pearl in a shell." Mary stiffened, but Anne only smiled faintly. "Whispers carry far, then." "Farther than you think," the woman said. "The governor of Jamaica has sworn the name of Bonnie like a curse. He says no woman shall shame the king's order and live free. They have put price to your heads, yours and the quiet ones, gold enough to tempt even friends." Rackham bristled, but Mary's expression remained calm. "Then we must be careful who we call friend," she said. The woman handed them a jug of water, heavy with coolness, and a basket of fruit. "Take these, and take this counsel. The sea gives freedom only to those who know it cannot last forever. Spend your days as though each one were borrowed, for borrowed things must be returned." They thanked her, left coin enough for her to live a month, and returned to the ship. As the William weighed anchor, Anne stood at the stern, watching the old woman shrink to a figure no larger than her net, weaving steadily, each knot tying order into a world that was already fraying. That night, under a canopy of stars, the crew gathered on deck. No dice, no song, only talk. Rackham called them together, lantern light falling across wary faces. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of his thoughts. "They've named us," he said. "Not just pirates, but by name. The gallows wait for every one of us, but most especially for Anne and for Mark." His gaze slid toward Mary, and though he did not speak her true name, the weight of it pressed heavy in the silence. Anne stepped forward then, her figure cutting against the lantern glow. "If they want me, let them come. I'll not bow to a law written by men who never felt salt in their blood." A murmur of approval rose, low but fierce. Mary followed, quieter but no less firm. "We are not children to be frightened by paper. We've faced storms fiercer than ink, men with sharper steel. But we must be wise. Pride fills graves faster than bullets." The crew listened, nodding. Some shifted uneasily, others straightened as if a weight had been shared. Rackham gave them no promise of easy seas, only the plain truth. The net tightens. But as long as wind fills these sails, we choose our course. We may not choose for long, but tonight it is still ours. A silence followed, broken only by the creak of timbers, the hush of waves. It was not despair that held them. It was clarity. They understood now that their path narrowed. that each choice grew heavier. Yet with that came a strange kind of calm. Anne leaned against the rail, gazing at the stars. "They can write what they please," she murmured. "The sea writes louder." Mary joined her, their shoulders brushing. In the dark, unseen by most, Anne's hand brushed briefly against Mary's. Not a gesture of romance, nor even of comfort, only recognition. They were two women named by men who wished them erased. And yet, here they stood, alive, defiant, the sea itself carrying them forward. Above, the constellations burned, indifferent and eternal. Below, the William slipped through water that gleamed with a faint silver trail of phosphorescence, as if the sea itself marked their passage, not in chains, but in light. The calm night carries uneasy silence. Evening bled slowly across the horizon, drawing long shadows over the deck of the William. The sails whispered in a wind neither weak nor strong, only steady, a companion that had not yet chosen sides. For a time, the ship moved with a sense of ordinary purpose. Lines tended, guns cleaned, bread broken into equal shares. But beneath the surface of such tasks lay a weight that made even laughter feel thin. The crew could feel the net around them now, invisible yet pressing, the world shrinking mile by mile. Anne stood by the bow, eyes narrowed at the edge of the sea where light gave way to dark. Her hand rested loosely on the rail, but her stance carried readiness, a body alert to every shift of wind. Mary joined her in silence, as she often did. For long minutes, neither spoke. The sound of the water against the hull filled the space, calm and inexorable. At last, Anne spoke, her voice low. "Feels like the sea is holding its breath." Mary gave a small nod. "Storms do that. So do men. Before battle." Behind them, Rackham paced the quarterdeck. The lantern light caught his features, softer than the legends that would later paint him fierce. He was restless, shifting his gaze between the sails above and the shadowy horizon. He wanted control, but the sea was never generous with it. He could only choose how to steer when the moment arrived, not whether the moment would come. The men, too, sensed it. Dice were cast, but half-heartedly. The usual bawdy songs stopped after only a verse or two. Even the cook's grumbling came softer, as if words themselves could summon unwanted ears. Fletcher muttered to a knot of men about pardons, about gold paid for betrayal. But the crew, hardened by storms and months at sea, had grown wary of easy promises. Most turned away. Some spat. Fletcher's voice faded into the hum of the rigging. Morning came with skies washed clear, the kind of deceptive beauty sailors know to distrust. The horizon stretched endless, no sail in sight, but the air carried tension like a string drawn taut. Men moved briskly through the routine, hauling lines, swabbing deck, mending canvas, yet each action felt sharper, more precise, as though some unseen eye watched. Rackham gathered them mid-deck, his coat plain, his voice quiet but carrying. "We cannot outrun. They're net forever," he said. "We all know it. If the Navy comes, they'll want us alive for the gallows. That's their game. We must decide if we play it a murmur spread, not panic, but sober recognition." Anne stepped forward, chin lifted. "I'll not swing for a crown that calls us less than men because we are women. If they come, I fight." Mary followed, her voice steadier than iron. "They will not give us peace. So let us take what dignity we can." Rackham looked across his crew, faces lined by sun and salt, men who had lived more fiercely in a year than most on land in a lifetime. "We can fight," he said, "or we can throw down arms and pray for mercy. I'll not force a man's hand." The silence stretched. Then, One by one, heads lifted. A topman spat to leeward and grinned without mirth. If we're to hang, let them earn it. Another thumped his fist against the rail. A third raised his mug. The sound swelled. Not wild cheers, but the heavy assent of men who had chosen. Anne's gaze found Mary's. No words passed, but both knew. Their stand would not be forgotten. The day wore on. The William prowled the blue waters as if nothing had changed, yet every man aboard carried the knowledge of what lay ahead. Powder was checked twice. Flints struck to be sure of spark. Cutlasses were sharpened until they caught the sun. Pistols were loaded and set carefully in racks. The deck smelled of oil, salt, and anticipation. Toward late afternoon, a dark smudge rose on the northern horizon. At first, it might have been a cloud, but clouds do not hold steady. A mast showed, then another. A sloop, lean and purposeful, sails tight as a drawn bowstring. Behind it, farther still, two more. The murmurs began. Rackham raised his glass, then lowered it. "Royal Navy," he said flatly. No one argued. The crew tightened lines, hands quick but not frantic. Anne tied back her hair, her face calm, almost serene. Mary checked her pistols, her movements deliberate. Rackham gave orders, low, sharp, efficient. The William turned to meet the wind, her bow lifting, her timbers creaking with resolve. Evening fell, red light bleeding across the sea. The three Navy ships grew larger, their formation measured and merciless. The William cut her wake toward them, not fleeing, not yielding, only steady, sails billowed with the last honest wind of the day. Above, the stars began to prick through the dusk, silent witnesses to what would follow. The calm was gone now, replaced by something harder, readiness. The sea no longer held its breath. It exhaled, long and slow, carrying the William and her crew toward the stand that history would remember. Silence lingers after the storm has passed. The dawn came pale and reluctant, as though the sun itself hesitated to look upon what had transpired. The William drifted, battered, her sails ragged, her guns silent now. Smoke clung low to the water, spreading in thin ribbons that carried the acrid taste of powder and the faint bitterness of defeat. Splinters and broken spars floated nearby, bobbing like forgotten thoughts. The deck bore its scars openly. Blackened planks, scorch marks where fire had threatened to take hold, stains dark and unyielding. A few men lay bound, heads bowed, their shoulders heavy with exhaustion more than fear. The air was not loud with victory songs or cries of despair, only the measured movements of Marines securing lines, the clink of irons, the rustle of canvas overhead. Anne and Mary stood together, wrists shackled, but backs unbent. Their hair was disheveled, their clothes torn, yet their presence seemed taller than the mast itself. Where Rackham slumped in defeat, they radiated defiance. The officers who came aboard paused when they beheld them, for the sight of women among captured pirates was stranger than smoke itself. The British commander, a man of clipped speech and neat wig, regarded them with something between distaste and fascination. "Two women," he muttered, as though speaking the words aloud made them less impossible. Mary answered, her tone even, her eyes bright. "Two sailors. Two fighters." No less, no more. Anne's smile was sharper. "If you had fought as we did, perhaps you would not look so shocked." The commander turned away, unwilling to dignify them further, but already whispers spread among the Marines. Some shook their heads, scandalized. Others looked sidelong, grudgingly respectful. Bound though they were, Anne and Mary remained the fiercest figures on the deck, their legend already writing itself in the minds of those who watched. The journey to Jamaica was a passage of silence, Chains rattled with each roll of the ship. Food came in wooden bowls, plain and tasteless. The hold smelled of sweat and damp canvas. Yet even here, even in darkness, the two women carried themselves with dignity. Anne sat with her back straight, eyes far away, as though already looking beyond walls. Mary coughed often, a deep rattle that spoke of fever, yet her hands remained steady when they gripped the cup or the rail. Men spoke in murmurs. Some cursed Rackham for surrendering. Others muttered of pardons lost. But when they spoke of the women, their tones shifted. No longer were they curiosities or objects of jest. They were fighters, remembered for standing when others faltered. Even in chains, they had claimed something no law could strip away. In Spanish Town, the trial was brief. Sentences read, gallows prepared. The names of the condemned were listed one after another. Yet when Anne and Mary declared their condition, pleading their bellies, invoking the old law that no pregnant woman might hang, the room stirred. Judges frowned, clerks whispered, matrons were called to examine. Days stretched as decisions were weighed. For Rackham and the others, the end came swift. For Anne and Mary, the rope was stayed, replaced by uncertainty. Rumors spread quickly beyond the courtroom. Some said the women had tricked the court with clever words, others that fate itself had shielded them. To the common folk, it mattered little. The story was too rich to resist. Two women, pirates in men's garb, fierce in battle, clever enough to cheat the hangman. Already, pamphlets were being drafted, tavern tales embroidered. Mary's health faltered in the months that followed. Fever took her before rope or mercy could decide. She died quietly, still defiant, her true name spoken at last among those who remembered. Anne lingered, her fate uncertain. Records broke apart like driftwood. Some said her wealthy father purchased her freedom. Others whispered she escaped to another life, perhaps even another sea. The truth slipped away, as truths often do, leaving legend in its place. Years later, far from Spanish Town, far from gallows and courts, stories of Anne and Mary traveled faster than ships. In Charleston, in London, in small harbors where men gathered with mugs and dreams, their names were spoken in the same breath as Blackbeard and Roberts. Yet their tale carried a sharper edge, for it defied not only law, but custom itself. Two women who refused to bow, who lived as they chose, who fought like any man, and perhaps better. And in the quiet of an evening, when ships creaked at anchor and lanterns burned low, old sailors would tell it soft. How Anne Bonny, with eyes like fire, had cursed her captain for surrendering. How Mary Red, disguised yet unyielding, had fought with a knife that found its mark true. How together, back to back, they had stood against the tide until the weight of numbers bore them down. Children listening by the hearth widened their eyes. Wives paused in their sewing, imagining what it must have been to hold steel in hand and refuse the world's decree. Men who had once sworn never to respect a woman's hand at sea found themselves shaking their heads, half admiring, half unsettled. The truth dimmed as the years rolled on, as truths do, but legends grew. And sometimes, on nights when the sea was calm and the stars shone steady, someone would murmur, "Perhaps she still lives. Perhaps she walks the harbor in Havana, or raises a child in secret, or waits for a ship of her own once more." The William was long gone, her timbers scattered, her guns melted for other wars. Rackham's name faded, mocked more than remembered. But Anne Bonny and Mary Red, those names endured. They became more than women, more than pirates. They became symbols of a freedom too brief, too fierce to be bound in chains. And so their story settles now, like embers in a hearth, warm, but no longer blazing. The storm has passed. The sea is calm. The listener, too, may rest easy, knowing that while the golden age of piracy has slipped into history, its echoes remain, soft, persistent, like the hush of waves against a shore. The last cannon has fallen silent. The gallows stand empty in memory, and the sea hums its timeless lullaby. Sleep now, with their story as company, Anne and Mary defiant, the ocean eternal, the night safe. Good night.